We are looking at a book today that, if you really sit quietly and listen to what it's saying, fundamentally dismantles everything society assumes about schooling, culture, and the human mind.
It really does. It's a profound challenge.
It's a text called The Aims of Education by Alfred Whitehead. And the mission for you today is to just quietly unravel his core arguments on how we actually learn.
Right. Starting with his rather aggressive opening ideas about culture and following that thread all the way to how the human brain develops in these distinct natural rhythms.
And right off the bat, he targets a concept that I think we are entirely obsessed with today, the idea of being well-informed.
Oh, absolutely.
He essentially says that a person who is merely well-informed, someone just stuffed with facts, is the most useless bore on God's earth.
It is a phenomenal opening argument, especially when you think about our modern context, right? We live in an era where you can pull out your phone and access a Wikipedia article on any topic in seconds. We conflate data retrieval with intelligence. But true culture, according to this book, has absolutely nothing to do with gathering scraps of disconnected information.
Which is so counterintuitive to how we're raised.
It is. He argues culture is the activity of thought. It is a profound receptiveness to beauty and humane feeling. Information is just the raw material. If it isn't actively processed, it's entirely useless.
Wait, but isn't there a danger in dismissing information? If we don't prioritize a broad foundation of facts, don't we risk raising generations who are totally ignorant of basic science or history?
That's the natural fear.
I mean, how do you even have the activity of thought without a massive database of facts in your head?
It's a fair question, but it misses the distinction between active knowledge and what he calls inert ideas.
Inert ideas.
Yeah, he doesn't say facts are bad. He says facts that just sit in the mind without being utilized, tested, or thrown into fresh combinations are actively harmful. He uses a Latin phrase to describe this: corruptio optimi, pessima.
The corruption of the best is the worst.
Exactly. When a school, which should be this quiet place of intellectual ferment, overloads a student with inert ideas, it decays into mere pedantry and routine. Think of it like a computer with a full hard drive but zero processing power. The data is there, but nothing is happening.
And he actually uses a really interesting anecdote to ground this idea, to show that cramming a kid's head full of facts isn't what makes them a thinker.
The Archbishop Temple story.
Yes. He mentions an observation by Archbishop Temple regarding a man whose success in later life was a complete surprise, given that as a boy at the rugby school, he had been entirely undistinguished. The Archbishop said, "It is not what they are at 18, it is what they become afterwards that matters."
Because the intellectual self-development, the true shaping of the self, mostly takes place later, between the ages of 16 and 30.
Which takes so much pressure off those early years.
It should. The role of early education isn't to force a lifetime of encyclopedic knowledge into a child's head before they reach adulthood. It is to prepare the soil. If you pack the soil too tightly with rigid, disconnected facts, nothing can grow. The mind becomes bogged down by the sheer weight of these inert ideas.
He makes a rather provocative observation about this very thing, pointing to who actually escapes this intellectual decay. He highlights clever, uneducated women in middle life.
Yes.
He notes that they are often the most cultured part of the community.
And we have to look closely at why he says that. It's not an argument against educating women, obviously.
Right, of course not.
It's an observation that because these particular women in his time were excluded from the rigid fact-cramming machinery of formal schooling, they were saved from the horrible burden of inert ideas.
They were spared the damage.
Exactly. They actually engaged with the world. They observed, they interacted, their minds remained active and genuinely connected to reality. Rather than being stunted by memorizing lifeless facts for exams, it's a striking vindication of natural intelligence over artificial schooling.
Which brings us to his solution. To protect against this mental dry rot, he lays down two absolute educational commandments. The first is, do not teach too many subjects.
And the second is, what you teach, teach thoroughly.
He is pleading for restraint here.
He is. Let the main ideas introduced to a child be few, but let them be vastly important. If you only teach a few fundamental concepts, you have the time to throw those ideas into every conceivable combination.
You give them space to breathe.
Yes. You let the learner experience the joy of discovery by applying those ideas here and now in the exact circumstances of their actual life.
Here and now. I want to pause on that because the book presents a really beautiful philosophical view of time and specifically the sanctity of the present moment.
It's one of the most powerful parts of his argument.
He argues that depreciating the present is the most deadly harm you can inflict on a young mind. He states that the present contains all that there is. It is holy ground.
Holy crown.
Yeah. We only learn about the past to equip us for the present.
Think about how history is traditionally taught. It's often presented as a dusty archive of things that happened to dead people, but he argues against being deceived by the pedantry of dates. Just because an age existed 2,000 years ago doesn't make it any more past than an age that existed 200 years ago.
It's all just human experience.
Exactly. He uses this incredible imagery of the communion of saints. The ages of Shakespeare, of Sophocles, of Virgil, they are not lost. They are an inspiring assemblage, and they have only one possible hall of meeting.
And that meeting place is the present mind.
The present mind. Your mind, as you listen to this right now, is the only place where history actually lives.
And if education is bringing all these great forces into the present mind, then education must inherently be profoundly useful. He draws on a French proverb. To understand all is to forgive all. He broadens that to say education is useful precisely because understanding is useful.
And because understanding is useful, an idea must continuously prove its worth in the real world. In scientific training, he says the very first thing to do with an idea is to prove it.
But he doesn't just mean...
No, he extends the meaning of the word prove. He doesn't just mean logical deduction on a chalkboard. He means proving its worth in life. Proof and utilization are not two separate steps happening years apart. You keep the theoretical exposition short and rigid, and then you apply it immediately to reality.
But this completely flies in the face of how we actually operate. We constantly tell students, learn this abstract rule now, memorize this formula, and maybe in 10 years when you have a job, you'll see why it's useful.
We do. We treat the brain like it's a piece of raw material that has to be prepped before it can do any real work.
He points to this traditional defense of rote learning, the idea that the mind is a dead instrument and you must first sharpen it and only use it later.
He absolutely dismantles that concept. The mind is not a tool hanging in a shed waiting to be sharpened. It is a perpetual activity. It is delicate, receptive, and highly responsive to stimulus.
You cannot postpone its life.
You simply cannot. Whatever interest you are trying to evoke, whatever powers you are trying to strengthen, they must be exercised immediately. Now, he acknowledges this is incredibly difficult to execute in a classroom.
Because it requires the teacher to be constantly alive to the present moment.
Right. In fact, he notes that whenever a textbook is written that has real, profound educational worth, reviewers will often complain that it is too difficult to teach from.
Because real education is messy.
Yeah.
It's much easier to follow what he calls the broad primrose path.
The easy route.
Yes, an easy route in education is an evil path because it inevitably leads to a nasty destination. A place where students simply learn by heart the exact questions likely to be asked on the next external examination.
External standardized exams are the ultimate enemy of the active mind in this framework.
He uses a very vivid architectural comparison to explain what these exams do to human intellect. He asks us to visualize the zigzag molding around a Norman arch in an ancient cathedral.
Let's translate that Norman arch metaphor into something a bit more modern so we can really picture it.
Okay.
It's essentially the difference between looking at a beautiful, hand-carved, antique wooden table versus a sterile, mass-produced, flat-pack desk.
That makes perfect sense.
The hand-carved ancient work is deeply beautiful because it is varied. It reflects the idiosyncrasy, the unique spirit, and the immediate context of the individual workman. In some places it's crowded, in others it's expanded.
Has a soul.
Yes. But if you look at modern restorative work or your mass-produced desk, it is exact to measure. It's perfectly uniform, and because of that lack of humanity, it is hideous. External exams are the mass-produced desk,
They force an equal weight on all subjects for all students.
demanding uniformity, which completely destroys the natural, beautiful specialism inherent in human minds. Mankind is naturally specialist. One person grasps a whole abstract subject, another connects deeply with brilliant detached examples.
And when you exclude that specialism to satisfy a standardized test, you destroy the vitality of life.
You crush the very thing you're supposed to be nurturing.
So if vitality is missing, and we fracture the mind with all these separate sterile subjects, what is the fix? He offers a central solution to eradicate this disconnection, and it's quite radical. He says there's only one subject matter for education. Just one.
And that is life in all its manifestations.
Think about the tragic way we offer children a fractured reality. We teach algebra from which nothing follows, geometry from which nothing follows, science from which nothing follows, history from which nothing follows.
It is like a rapid table of contents a deity might read over before actually bothering to create a world.
I want to dig into how he redeems these specific subjects, because it's not just theoretical. Take algebra. Today we teach quadratic equations as if they are abstract parlor tricks just to pass a test.
Right, and he argues that algebra is actually the intellectual instrument created for rendering clear the quantitative aspects of the world. The world is infected with quantity. You cannot evade it.
So instead of drawing dry graphs, just for the sake of drawing them,
You use quantitative analysis to understand humanity.
he gives a very sweeping example of this. He suggests plotting the curves of history. Imagine using algebra to map the journey from the tales of medieval pilgrims, dropping into the demographic collapse of the Black Death, and rising again into modern labor troubles.
Brilliant.
You're connecting the abstract science of algebra directly to the raw, beating heart of historical and social phenomena. You look for real causal connections, completely integrating the disciplines so they reflect life.
He performs the exact same redemption on geometry. Geometry must move far beyond memorizing abstract propositions on a chalkboard. He points to the brilliant successes in industrial neighborhoods where theoretical ideas are immediately extended into workshop practice.
Grounding it in the physical space.
Exactly. For secondary schools, he suggests that geometry should be taught through surveying and map making. You give the pupils a simple drawing apparatus, a surveyor's chain, and a compass. Have them go outside and construct a physical map of a small local district.
So they are literally walking the geometry.
Yes, as they observe the fields, the roads, the contours of the earth, they are simultaneously learning the geometric proofs. The theoretical and the physical become one seamless reality.
It's about grounding abstract thought in the physical dirt of the real world. And this leads us to a concept in the book that sounds purely aesthetic at first, but he elevates it to the absolute peak of intellectual achievement. He calls it style. And he defines it very specifically. Style is an aesthetic sense based on admiration for the direct attainment of a foreseen end, simply and without waste.
It is the ultimate differentiator between the amateur and the expert. The amateur might have immense versatility, they might play around with a lot of different ideas, but they lack foresight. Style is the exclusive privilege of the expert.
With style, your mind is not distracted by irrelevancies.
Exactly. The administrator with style hates waste. The engineer with style economizes material. He states that style is the ultimate morality of mind. It is the restraining of raw power into calculable foresight.
But if you want to achieve this level of style, this deep connected mastery of life, you can't do it in a rigid system, which leads to his very practical, impassioned plea for school autonomy.
This is where he gets very structural.
He argues that the school itself, not the individual student, and certainly not a distant governing board or government body, must be the true educational unit.
Because if you subject every school to a uniform external assessment, you end up with what he bluntly calls one dunghill of inert ideas into another.
But if every school makes its own curriculum, don't we get massive chaos? How do you ensure any standard of quality if there's no central oversight dictating what these kids need to know?
That's the fear, right? But his argument is that a standardized, unyielding machine is guaranteed to fail anyway because it cannot adapt to the local environment or the specific students.
It's the IKEA desk again.
Exactly. Every school should be inspecting itself, granting its own leaving certificates based on its own unique curriculum. That curriculum must be evolved by its own specific staff, tailored to its specific community, and molded to the needs of its students.
The machinery of education should be yielding and adaptable.
A society that does not value locally trained, adaptable intelligence is doomed.
And then the book takes a turn into the foundational purpose of all this. He states that the essence of all this education we've been discussing is fundamentally religious.
But he completely strips away the dogma from that word.
He isn't talking about theology. He defines religious education as an education that simply inculcates two things: duty and reverence.
It's a profound redefinition. Duty arises from the realization that we have potential control over the course of events. When attainable knowledge could have changed an outcome, then ignorance is no longer an excuse. Ignorance becomes the guilt of vice.
You have a duty to understand the world so you can act responsibly in it.
And reverence.
What is reverence in this context?
Reverence is the deep perception that the present moment holds within itself the complete sum of existence, backwards and forwards. It is the whole amplitude of time, which is eternity, captured right now in the present mind.
It is a staggering philosophical foundation. We have to strip away inert ideas, recognize the sanctity of the present, cultivate the morality of style, and instill duty and reverence.
But understanding that foundation is only the beginning.
Once we know what true education is, we are faced with the mechanics of human growth. How does the brain actually absorb this? This brings us to his next major framework, the rhythm of education.
The premise here sounds incredibly simple, yet it is entirely revolutionary when applied. By the rhythm of education, he means the principle that different subjects and entirely different modes of study should be undertaken at fitting times.
The curriculum must perfectly match the pupil's specific stage of mental development.
He acknowledges that this sounds like a basic truism, but he points out that it has been completely and disastrously mishandled in actual educational practice.
Because systems simply ignore the true psychology of the growing mind.
Think back on your own life for a second. Consider those frustrating moments in a classroom when your own natural mental development was completely out of sync with what you were being forced to memorize.
You were taught answers to questions you hadn't even learned how to ask yet.
It forces us to ask a difficult question about our modern systems. If our brains did their heaviest, most miraculous lifting before we could even speak, why do we assume a teenager sitting silently at a desk, passively receiving information, is the pinnacle of human learning?
To truly understand how to fix this mistiming, to grasp the actual rhythm of how a human being learns, we have to go back to the very beginning. We have to look at the genesis of human development. We have to examine the incredibly complex, monumental tasks of infancy. And that brings us right back to the very heart of the book.
It really does.
Because we're continuously reminded that education isn't this mechanical industrial process of just cramming facts into a passive receptacle.
Right. It's about cultivating a living, breathing mind.
Exactly. And as we move forward into his thoughts on the rhythm of education, he presents what I think is a rather profound challenge to how we structure learning right from the ground up.
He really does dismantle things here. He starts by going after what we might call the fallacy of the easy-to-hard progression.
Which is everywhere.
It is. We have this deeply ingrained societal assumption that education just has to be a steady, uniform climb up a very gentle slope.
Right. The conventional wisdom that you must introduce the absolute simplest, most digestible subjects first.
Yes, and only when those are perfectly mastered do we carefully spoon-feed the slightly harder concepts. But he shatters this entirely by pointing us toward the natural world, specifically toward the infant.
I have to admit, when I first read that section in the book, I was a bit skeptical.
Oh, sure. It's jarring.
Because we naturally want to protect children from overwhelming complexity. But then he asks you to just sit and consider the sheer monumental scale of what a baby actually achieves.
It's staggering when you think about it.
We think we're protecting them by withholding complex subjects, but infants are currently engaged in tackling the absolute hardest intellectual task imaginable.
The acquisition of spoken language.
Exactly.
It's an astonishing feat when you break it down into its parts. Think about what that process actually requires of a developing brain. They are connecting highly abstract meanings with entirely arbitrary sounds.
Right.
It requires an intense, really sophisticated analysis of complex ideas, an equally intense analysis of phonetic noises, and then the physical coordination of the lungs, the throat, the tongue, to reproduce those noises.
It's an appalling task, really, when you lay it out on paper like that.
It is, yet they do it.
But I suppose the question is, why do they succeed at something so staggeringly difficult when, a teenager might fail a basic algebra test? Is it just neuroplasticity?
Well, neuroplasticity plays a role, certainly. But his argument goes much deeper into the environment and the rhythm of need.
The rhythm of need.
Yes, they do it because nature dictates that it is essential for life. The environment demands it, and so the brain just rises to the occasion.
The miracle of the infant learning to speak is undeniable.
And the point he makes is that with this absolute miracle staring us right in the face, we really must cease talking nonsense about postponing harder subjects simply because we deem them too difficult for a young mind.
Because if the context demands it and the interest is there, the mind can perform miracles.
Precisely.
When you put it like that, it makes you realize how we artificially limit ourselves. Rita, think about how you approach a new hobby today.
Oh, absolutely.
If you decide you want to learn to code or play the guitar, do you start by reading a dry manual of the easiest mechanics? Or do you dive straight into trying to build an app or play your favorite song, even if it's technically way too hard for you?
We usually just dive in.
Right. And that instinct leads right into another rigid rule we impose on ourselves, which he calls the principle of necessary antecedents.
Which is the idea that subject A must be perfectly mastered before you are even allowed to glance at subject B.
It's a principle that seems incredibly firm on the surface. It feels very logical.
But as he writes, it dissolves entirely under scrutiny. I mean, yes, there is a literal truth to it in some very narrow mechanical senses. You obviously can't read Hamlet until you've learned the alphabet.
Right, or study fractions until you understand what an integer is.
Exactly. But the danger lies in taking that narrow mechanical truth and applying it as a universal law of intellectual exploration. He gives a really beautiful counterexample to this.
The Homer example.
Yes. He says you cannot read Homer before you can read, but you do not need to read to experience the Odyssey.
That distinction changes everything.
It really does.
Yeah. For centuries, countless children and wandering bards sailed the seas of romance with Odysseus through the spoken word of a storyteller by the fire. You didn't need to pass a literacy exam to feel the spray of the Aegean Sea or the sorrow of Ithaca.
You just had to be there and listen.
And I would ask you, listening right now, to consider in your own life how often you gatekeep knowledge from yourself. How often do you hold yourself back from exploring a fascinating historical era or a complex scientific theory simply because you think you haven't completed the supposedly required prerequisite steps?
We lock ourselves out of the romance of learning.
We do. We convince ourselves we haven't earned the right to be there yet.
Which brings us to the core of his philosophy, really, because recognizing that artificial gatekeeping leads directly into his central thesis on the rhythm of education.
That mental growth is not a uniform, steady climb.
Right. It is not an unyielding flat line of progression. Life itself is essentially periodic. We have the daily rhythms of waking and sleeping, work and play. We have the grand seasonal shifts.
The yearly cycles.
Exactly. The mind is a living organism, and therefore it too operates on subtle, recurring periods of mental growth. Education fails miserably when it ignores this rhythm and treats the mind like a machine that can just be run at a constant speed.
There's a quiet relief in realizing that learning doesn't have to be a straight, punishing line. It's a cyclic, breathing, rhythmic process.
It is.
And to explain this, the book looks backward to the philosopher Hegel. He adapts Hegel's 3 stages of progress: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis.
And we should probably pause to translate Hegel there because that can sound quite dense.
Please do.
Hegel's basic idea is that you start with an initial concept, the thesis. Then you encounter its opposite or its limitations, which is the friction of the antithesis.
Let's push back.
Right. And finally, you resolve that conflict by merging them into a higher, more complete understanding, which is the synthesis.
Okay.
Whitehead takes that very high-level German philosophy and grounds it in a much more human, relatable framework for the classroom.
Yeah.
He renames them the stage of romance, the stage of precision, and the stage of generalization.
Let's sit with the stage of romance for a moment, because he argues this is where all true learning must originate.
It has to start here.
This is the stage of first apprehension. When you first encounter a new subject, it shouldn't be presented as a dry list of facts to be memorized. It possesses the vividness of novelty.
It's full of unexplored connections.
Half-disclosed possibilities, glimpses of a vast, mysterious territory. In this stage, knowledge isn't dominated by systematic procedure. It is an awakening.
The allegory he uses to describe this awakening is just perfect. He asks you to picture Robinson Crusoe, stranded alone on his isolated island, suddenly seeing a human footprint in the sand.
Such a powerful image.
Now, if we were speaking purely technically, the footprint is just a mere indentation. The sand is just sand, and the island is just an island. But the sudden perception of that footprint changes the entire universe for Crusoe.
It represents a romantic realization of a whole new world of possibilities.
Exactly. It connects his lonely, isolated existence to the busy, complex world of humanity. The footprint is the spark.
I want you to remember the last time you felt that specific thrill. Think of the last time you stumbled onto a new passion. Maybe you watched a documentary about astrophysics, or you heard a piece of jazz that just stopped you in your tracks, and you felt that sudden rush of realizing how much there is to discover.
You didn't know the math, you didn't know the music theory.
But you felt the wonder. That is the ferment stirring in the mind. That is romance.
But as beautiful as that romance is, a mind cannot survive on it alone.
No.
If you only ever experience romance, you become a dilettante, always starting things and never mastering them. This brings us to the inevitable second phase, which is the stage of precision.
The shift in tone.
Yes. Romance provides the ferment, but precision provides the form. This is the stage of grammar. It is the exactness of formulation.
It proceeds by forcing the student to accept a given way of analyzing the facts, piece by piece, bit by bit.
You are intentionally subordinating the wild width of the relationship to the strict exactness of the details.
But I have to push back a little on how that is usually applied. Because doesn't that exactness often just kill the romance entirely?
It does, and that is perhaps the most crucial warning in the entire book. Precision is completely, utterly barren if it is not built upon a foundation of romance.
I have to have that foundation.
If you try to force a student to analyze facts without first allowing them to feel the wonder of the broader subject, you are asking them to analyze nothing. It becomes a series of meaningless statements produced artificially.
So if you haven't stood on the beach with Crusoe and felt the visceral shock of the footprint, then analyzing the depth and width of the impression in the sand is just a dead, soul-crushing exercise.
It's just digging in the dirt. And isn't that precisely where so much of traditional education loses its way?
It attempts to start in the stage of precision.
Exactly. It assumes the student arrives already caring about the depth of the footprint.
But if we allow the rhythm to play out naturally, the friction of precision eventually leads to the third phase, the stage of generalization.
This is Whitehead's equivalent of Hegel's synthesis.
It's a return to the romantic wonder of the first stage. But now the mind is armed with classified ideas and relevant techniques.
It is the fruition of the precise training. You understand the grammar, you know the mechanics, and now you can use them to explore the vast possibilities you glimpsed in the beginning, but with actual competence.
What I find so striking is that these stages aren't just a one-time event that takes 3 decades to unfold.
Oh, no, not at all.
They are a continual repetition of cycles, cycles within cycles, eddies within the stream of thought. If we return to our infant, the baby achieves a brilliantly complete cycle of this exact rhythm.
They really do.
The infant experiences the romance of the physical world, the awakening to objects and emotional relations. Then comes the intense daily precision of mastering spoken language, shaping the mouth, coordinating the sounds.
And finally, the generalization, where they use that newly mastered language to classify and wildly enjoy the world around them. It is a cycle that achieves complete success. And the book asks us to contrast that natural, beautiful success with the failure of the systems we typically impose later in life.
Like studying Latin.
Right. We take a 10-year-old child and decide they must study Latin, and we expect them to do it by a uniform system of formal training, a steady, unbroken march of precision, hoping that somehow, 10 years later at age 20, they will achieve success.
Which almost never happens.
The natural result is almost always failure. The interest dies, and the acquirement is minimal. Why? Not because the task of learning Latin is intrinsically harder than an infant learning to speak from nothing.
It fails because the task is set in an unnatural way.
Completely devoid of rhythm, without the vital stimulus of intermediate successes.
We rob them of the rhythm. And this brings us to a phase of life he describes with such poignant accuracy. He calls it the great romance of adolescence, roughly spanning the ages of 8 to 13.
Such a crucial time.
This is a quiet yet explosive age of discovery. Ideas, facts, stories, histories, the vivid artistry of words and sounds and colors, they all crowd into the child's life.
The child is no longer just observing.
Right, they're imagining, stirring with feelings and impulses. It is an era dominated by wonder.
Yet it is a sobering thought, as he notes, that upon this delicate age there so often falls the dark shadow of the crammer.
The crammer.
Right when the mind is craving the romance of the wider world, we assault it with an uncoordinated, unrhythmic collection of distracting scraps.
We force an undifferentiated concentration on a preliminary general education that demands precise recollection of details across a massive, systematic scale. We've all felt the modern version of that crammer. Today, it usually takes the form of a terrifying, passive-aggressive green owl on our phones, reminding us that if we don't precisely conjugate 10 verbs right this second, we will lose our streak.
Or a towering stack of digital flashcards completely divorced from any actual conversation or cultural context.
We destroy the wonder by forcing precision at the wrong time.
We destroy it by not understanding how to shift dominance. The rhythm requires that different subjects dominate the mind at different times.
You can't force precision in everything all at once.
For example, as the child leaves the romance of adolescence, around the ages of 12 to 15, he argues there should naturally be a mass attack upon language.
This is a period where language steps firmly into the stage of precision.
The mind is developmentally ready to concentrate on the exactness of grammar, to command the native tongue, to read French fluently, to grasp the mechanics of syntax.
The brilliance is that this doesn't last forever.
Mm.
As that intense, concentrated period of linguistic precision draws to a close around age 15, another pivot occurs.
The shift to generalization.
Right. Language moves into its phase of generalization, reading literature for the ideas, for the philosophy, not just parsing the grammar. And at that exact moment, science, which has been simmering quietly in the background in its own stage of romance, steps forward,
Science enters a brief, intense, perhaps one-year stage of precision.
taking the spotlight.
Yes. The student takes the discursive knowledge they've gathered about nature and geometry and formulates the main principles. They put together the pieces. He talks about garnering our crops in their due season.
I love that phrasing.
In today's terms, that just means letting your brain hyperfixate on the thing it naturally wants to learn right now, rather than forcing it to multitask across 5 different, unrelated subjects with equal intensity.
We must allow one subject to breathe in the background, while another takes the focused spotlight of precision.
And if we manage that rhythm correctly, it carries the student with their passion actually intact toward university education.
And the university, he states unequivocally, is the realm of generalization.
It is the grand stage of synthesis, and the book stresses a critical point here. It is absolutely fatal for a university student to arrive and simply do old work in the old spirit.
The posture of the mind must fundamentally shift.
During the school years, the student has been mentally bending over a desk, painfully rising from particular details to try and catch glimpses of general ideas. But at the university, the student must stand up and look around.
I find that image so compelling. To stand up and look around. At the university level, the details must be shed in favor of principles.
But he's very careful to define what he means by a principle because it isn't what we usually think of.
No, he's not talking about remembering exact textbook formulations or regurgitating lecture notes you memorized the night before an examination.
Because whatever specific detail you cram into a student, the chance of them meeting that exact detail in their later professional life is infinitesimally small.
A principle, thoroughly soaked into you, is not a formal statement. It is a mental habit.
It becomes the very way the mind instinctively reacts to the appropriate stimulus. The goal of the university is to convert knowledge into true mental power.
It is about how you apply those unconscious, common-sense principles to immediate, unpredictable circumstances.
Your learning is practically useless until you have lost your textbooks, burnt your notes, and forgotten the minutiae you learned by rote. What remains that intuitive grasp of the broad sweep of generality, that instinct for how to solve a problem that is power.
And this naturally elevates our discussion to his observation on the fading of ancient ideals. He notes that in the schools of antiquity, philosophers aspired to impart divine wisdom.
They sought a profound understanding of life itself.
Yet in modern education, we have lowered our sights drastically. We humbly aim merely to teach subjects. We have dropped from the pursuit of divine wisdom to the mere textbook knowledge of isolated, disconnected topics.
It is an educational failure sustained through the centuries. Of course, the ancients were not perfect, but they started with full ideals.
Right.
Wisdom, he clarifies, is not simply possessing a massive catalog of facts. You can easily acquire immense knowledge and remain entirely bare of wisdom.
Wisdom is the way in which knowledge is held.
It concerns the handling of knowledge, its selection, and crucially, its employment to add value to our immediate experience. Wisdom is the active, rhythmic mastery of knowledge.
And this concept of active mastery brings us to the rhythmic claims of freedom and discipline. We so often treat these two concepts as bitter enemies, don't we?
Constantly at war.
We view them as fighting each other, either in the classroom or in our own attempts at self-improvement.
We do, but they're not antagonists. They correspond perfectly to the 3 stages of the mental cycle we've been exploring.
The stage of romance is the period of freedom.
Exactly. The stage of precision is the period of discipline, and the stage of generalization is a glorious return to freedom, but now enriched and magnified by the discipline that came before.
He makes a profound assertion here. There can be no mental development without interest. Interest is the absolute prerequisite for attention and apprehension.
You can try to coax interest by means of punishments or rigid schedules, but without genuine interest, there will be no true progress.
Joy is the normal, healthy spur to learning. Enjoyment is the natural mode by which living organisms are excited towards self-development.
He uses the term élan vital, that vital spark, the intrinsic life force of the mind that compels it to reach out and grow.
An over-vigorous, undiscriminating discipline completely defeats its own object by simply extinguishing that spark and dulling the mind.
True discipline shouldn't feel like an alien weight pressing down on you from the outside. It should be the voluntary issue of free choice.
It is the necessary, temporary stiffening of effort, driven entirely by your own desire to master the romance that caught your eye in the first place.
You accept the heavy discipline of precision because you deeply desire the freedom on the other side.
It's a delicate balance, adjusting freedom and discipline to the natural sway, the to and fro of the developing personality. Neglecting this rhythm leads to the disappointment and burnout we see so often.
It does.
I would ask you to just sit with that for a moment and turn Whitehead's lens inward. Looking at your own life, your own career, or the subjects you are currently trying to master in the quiet hours of your evening. Are you respecting your own mental rhythm?
Are you trying to force a stage of harsh, unyielding precision on yourself before you've allowed the stage of romance to truly take root?
Are you demanding rigid discipline without first cultivating the joy?
When we fail to cultivate that joy, we end up with the profound tragedy of barren knowledge. We see it in the dulled minds of those whose education consisted solely of the acquirement of inert facts, completely lacking the essential sway of freedom. The mind is a growing organism.
It is not a rigid box waiting to be ruthlessly packed with alien ideas.
No.
Because recognizing this rhythm, this delicate, beautiful dance between the wild wonder of freedom and the necessary grounding weight of discipline, it changes everything about how we approach not just our formal schooling, but our entire lifelong intellectual journey.
And if we accept that knowledge must be transformed into power, we have to look very closely at the environment in which the mind works, the soil in which this organism is planted.
And the environment of the mind is exactly what Whitehead forces us to confront next. Because once we understand the rhythm, we must immediately ask how to sustain it against the structural forces that constantly seek to standardize it, which brings us to the very nature of...
Okay, let's unpack this quietly. We are looking at Alfred North Whitehead's classic philosophical text, The Aims of Education. It presents us with a profound and honestly almost startling examination of how the human mind actually acquires and uses knowledge.
It really is.
Yeah, we were moving entirely away from these rigid mechanical systems of schooling. Instead, we are stepping into a biological, living understanding of intellectual growth.
Right.
Our mission for you as we navigate this book is to explore the delicate, often misunderstood balance between freedom and discipline in learning. And along the way, we want to completely dismantle that artificial wall society has built between what we call technical education and liberal education. So let's just sit with this for a moment and reflect on what it truly means to learn.
I think to really get there, it requires a fundamental shift in how we perceive the mind itself. We have to strip away the assumptions we've gathered from, decades of traditional schooling, where the mind is treated as this passive receptacle.
Like a container.
Exactly. Whitehead insists that we are not dealing with a lifeless mechanism that simply needs to be assembled or programmed on an assembly line. We were dealing with a living organism. And that distinction changes absolutely everything about how we should approach the cultivation of human intellect and character.
The book introduces a really striking metaphor right away regarding what Whitehead calls the stage of precision. And he vehemently rejects the idea of education as a process of packing articles into a trunk.
Yes, the trunk illusion.
Right, you can picture it. A static storage space. You neatly fold your facts, you place your algebraic formulas in the corner, you tuck away your historical dates, and you confidently expect them to stay there exactly as they are until you need them years later. I mean, I think about my own brain sometimes like a trunk full of useless high school calculus formulas I haven't touched in 15 years. Education, he argues, is simply not a trunk.
What's fascinating here is the true analog Whitehead provides instead. Education is like a living organism assimilating food.
Oh, that's good.
And we all know the biological reality of that process. How necessary it is to our physical health that food is not only palatable, but consumed under the right conditions. When you put Booths in a trunk, they patiently wait for you. But if you feed a child the wrong food, or feed them under the wrong environmental conditions, it doesn't just sit there in their stomach waiting to be useful.
No, it causes issues.
It becomes toxic. The organism actively rejects it, or it poisons the system.
That makes so much sense when you think about burnout. I mean, this perfectly explains why forcing discipline or rigid precision onto a student before they have experienced the romance, that initial wonder, the raw curiosity of a subject, leads to what the text calls inert knowledge. Or worse, it leads to a total contempt for ideas.
It's incredibly damaging.
You cannot force a young mind to rigorously analyze the exact grammatical structure of a language before they have felt the joy of its poetry or the romance of its stories. If you do, you aren't filling a trunk. You are feeding an organism something it simply cannot digest.
And without that adventure of romance, at best, you get a student who holds on to dead facts without any initiative to use them. They might pass the test, but the knowledge is lifeless. At worst, you cultivate a deep, enduring aversion to learning itself. The mind needs that initial spark, that unfiltered, expansive exploration where the emphasis is overwhelmingly on freedom. You have to allow the child to see and act for themselves, to feel the texture of the subject before you ask them to measure it.
Let me push back on that for a second, though. If we just let learners follow their raw curiosity and play around with the romance of a subject, doesn't that just lead to chaos?
What do you mean?
Well, think about trying to learn a musical instrument. If you only ever play around making noises because it's fun, you never actually learn to read sheet music or play a coherent song. We can't just leave them wandering aimlessly, right?
You've hit on the exact pivot Whitehead makes. He is very clear that we cannot simply leave students wandering in that initial state of wonder. Romance is absolutely crucial, but guidance is urgently required. He uses a brilliant, somewhat haunting phrase warning that without guidance, the student is left wandering in the intellectual maze of men in the glacial epoch.
The glacial epoch. So basically a vast, cold wilderness of disconnected observations. You have no tools to build a fire, no map to find your way.
Precisely. You were just stumbling through the ice. Which brings us to the middle stage of the learning rhythm, the stage of precision. This is the stage that traditional schooling completely dominates, often to a fault. But it has its rightful, vital place. Because once the freshness of inexperience is worn off, once there's been plenty of independent browsing and first-hand adventure, a new craving actually grows naturally within the learner.
A craving for structure.
Yes. The mind begins to desire order. It wants to understand the exactness of the subject. It realizes that to go further, to actually play that musical instrument, it needs the right tools.
So in this stage, we have to face the inescapable fact that there are right and wrong ways of doing things. We have to learn the exact generalizations, the fundamental details, and acquire a mastery of technique. The book explicitly notes that unstructured genius is a vain invention. And it gives us incredibly grounded comparisons. To write poetry, you must study meter. To build bridges, you must understand the strength of materials. The romance is still there in the background, keeping the mind fresh, but precision takes the wheel.
Right.
But how do we do that without falling back into packing the trunk trap?
That is where the text offers a masterclass in how to handle this stage of precision. The secret, Whitehead argues, is not a half-hearted, drawn-out attempt to memorize a vast, irrelevant vocabulary or an endless list of disconnected rules over years and years. The secret of this stage is pace.
Pace.
And the secret of pace is concentration.
Pace and concentration. The book states that a teacher should figure out exactly what few rules, what specific words or formulas are absolutely essential to the curriculum, and then bend every exercise to impress just those onto the memory. Master them rapidly and move on. He says, get your knowledge quickly and then use it. If you can use it, you will retain it. It sounds almost like a boot camp for the brain.
It is an approach of ruthless deafness.
Yeah.
By narrowing the area of precise knowledge to what is truly essential, you don't exhaust the student's vital energy. Think of it like pruning a tree so it can grow taller. If you make the area of required precision too wide, if you demand they memorize every single date in a century, you kill the interest and defeat your own object.
Yeah, they just shut down.
Exactly. If you make it too narrow, the student lacks an effective grip on the subject. But by carefully selecting the core principles and mastering them swiftly through intense concentration, you prepare the living organism for the final, most elevated phase of the cycle.
Which brings us to the third stage of this rhythmic cycle, generalization. This is described in the text as a reaction towards romance, a return to the freedom of the first stage, but with a massive transformative difference. The mind is no longer a rabble of wandering primitive thoughts. It is now a disciplined regiment. To put that in everyday terms, it's kind of like learning to drive a manual transmission car, right?
That is the perfect way to look at it.
Because at first, it's romance, the thrill of sitting behind the wheel. Then comes the precision phase, which is incredibly frustrating. You have to consciously think about pushing the clutch, matching the revs, shifting the gear. Your mind is hyper-focused on the exact rules.
Every single movement.
Right. But eventually, you reach the stage of generalization. You don't even think about your feet or your hands anymore. You are just driving. The rules have dissolved into muscle memory. You are free to look at the scenery, talk to your passenger, or navigate a new city.
And that shedding of the conscious memory of rigid facts is the beautiful conceptual shift of this final stage. The details are swallowed up by principles. Just as you don't explicitly retain in your conscious mind that 2 plus 2 equals 4, you trust it to habit. The details of your education retreat into your subconscious. This makes room for the active application of principles. The student now has their weapons, so to speak, and they want to use them.
Education here should be entirely about the production of active wisdom, and this leads to a wonderfully provocative idea in the book about what an ideal university professor should be. It is not someone who stands at a podium acting as an infallible fountain of endless facts. The university professor should exhibit themselves in their true character, as an ignorant man thinking.
I love that phrase, an ignorant man thinking. It strips away the pomp of academia. It implies that the professor is actively utilizing his small share of knowledge in front of his students. He is modeling the active adventure of thought, wrestling with concepts in real time, not just passively transmitting dead information from a textbook.
Showing the process.
Exactly. Whitehead argues that the paralysis of thought induced by the aimless accumulation of precise knowledge is the tragedy of modern universities. The entire goal of generalization is to emerge from the passivity of training into the active freedom of application.
Now, what's really crucial for us to understand is that this rhythm of romance, precision, and generalization isn't just a single linear timeline applied to a person's entire life. The book points out that this threefold rhythm happens on a macro scale. Roughly ages 1 to 13 for romance, 14 to 18 for precision, and 18 to 22 for generalization. But it also happens in minor eddies. It runs its course every week, every day, and within every single subject.
Yes, and this is a critical insight for anyone trying to understand intellectual development or even for anyone trying to learn a new skill as an adult. Not all subjects follow the same timeline. They don't magically arrive at the stage of precision simultaneously.
Because they require different types of engagement.
Precisely. Language, for example, begins in infancy. A child is immersed in the romance of speech, from birth listening to lullabies, mimicking sounds. So language naturally passes into the stage of precision relatively early. They are ready for grammar and spelling because the romance has been brewing for years.
But science, as the book highlights, is a completely different story. It's a latecomer. And this is where the text issues a severe warning, forcing the precise, rigorous inculcation of science onto a child at an early age wipes out their initiative. It destroys any chance of the topic having richness in their mind. Science must remain in the romance stage for years after language has already moved on to precision. If you demand precision in science too early, before the wonder of the physical world has been fully developed, you kill the impulse.
Imagine taking a child out to look at the stars. The romance is looking up at the night sky, feeling the vastness, wondering what those lights are. If you immediately force that child to sit down and calculate the orbital mechanics of Jupiter, you haven't taught them science.
You've taught them to hate looking at the sky.
Because again, we're dealing with a living organism. Its impulse towards self-development comes from within. You can stimulate it, you can guide it from the outside, but you can also kill it. The ultimate goal of all this stimulation and guidance is to lead the individual to a comprehension of the art of life. And by the art of life, the text means the complete achievement of varied activity, expressing the potentialities of that living creature.
Which gently moves our reflection toward the actual spirit of the learner. Education is fundamentally about character. And the book reflects deeply on how morality and religion suffer immensely when they are subjected to a premature stage of precision.
It's a profound point. Framing morality merely as a set of negative, isolated prohibitions, petty rules about what not to do, a simple checklist of sins to avoid, is identified as the deadly enemy of true religious or moral spirit.
It becomes a rigid framework rather than a lived experience.
Yes. When you insist on premature precision in morality, it becomes lifeless and cynical. Instead, the text argues that science, art, religion, and morality all take their rise from a sense of values within the structure of being. They arise from a sense of wonder, of curiosity, of reverence, and fundamentally, of beauty.
The aesthetic sense of realized perfection. Think about that for a second. The text emphasizes that history shows art is the very first activity of nations on the road to civilization. It is not some mere luxury added on after the real work of survival is done. Denying art and aesthetic emotion in education results in a profound spiritual blindness. It is a failure to develop the whole personality.
You truly cannot ignore the inner life without incredible loss. If you maim those aesthetic emotions, you weaken the force of the whole system of moral and spiritual apprehensions. A bare, cold intellectuality is bound to result in a massive crop of human failure.
Yeah.
It creates a population that is disheartened, inoculated against intellectual zeal, and completely inhospitable to new, beautiful ideas. People just become cogs in a machine.
And that idea of people becoming cogs in a machine leads us directly to the next major theme of the book. It's a theme that completely shatters how we structure society, schooling, and even our modern workplaces. It's the false divide between technical education and liberal education. The section begins with a deeply moving quote, Whitehead borrows from a play. He writes, "In my dreams, it is a country where the state is the church, and the church the people. It is a commonwealth in which work is play, and play is life."
It sounds mystical, almost utopian, but the text insists that this is the true, practical ideal of what technical education should be. To understand this, the book contrasts two historical symbolic figures, Plato and St. Benedict. Plato represents the classic liberal education. It is an education for thought and aesthetic appreciation, proceeding by imparting a knowledge of the masterpieces of imaginative literature and philosophy.
But there is a catch with Plato's ideal, right? His ideal implies leisure. It is an aristocratic education. Plato sat in the academy and theorized, but he did not bother himself to be a fellow worker with his slaves. His ideal maintains the dignity of the mind, but it is deeply, fundamentally divorced from physical labor and the practical, everyday realities of making a living.
Exactly. On the other hand, we have St. Benedict. He represents the technical ideal. The early Benedictine monks engaged in hard, physical, often grueling labor, farming, building, copying texts. But they rejoiced in it because their labor was completely transfused with intellectual and moral vision. They conceived of themselves as fellow workers with the divine.
It wasn't just mindless toil.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Even if you strip away the theological trappings for a modern context, the core idea remains incredibly powerful. Work, even manual or technical work, should be transfused with intellectual and moral vision. That vision turns the labor into a joy, triumphing over its weariness.
Think about your own job right now. Are you operating like Plato, disconnected from the execution of the work? Or are you operating like a modern-day St. Benedict, finding profound meaning and moral vision in the spreadsheets, the coding, the carpentry, or whatever it is you do? It's a staggering question, and it brings up a highly memorable, almost jarring detail from the text. Whitehead boldly calls the phrase, "necessity is the mother of invention," a silly proverb.
Which is funny because we hear that phrase all the time.
It's practically a corporate slogan today, accepted as absolute truth, but he just turns it completely on its head.
He clarifies that necessity is actually the mother of futile dodges. Let's really look at that. Think about a tired, bored, mentally indifferent workman. If he is driven only by the raw necessity of keeping his job or making quota, he will never produce first-class work or true inventive genius, no matter how skilled his hands are.
He's just trying to survive the shift.
Right. He will limit his production, he will evade inspection, and he will be a constant focus of discontent. He will invent a workaround just to get by.
So if my boss gives me an impossible deadline, I don't suddenly invent a revolutionary new branch of mathematics to solve the problem. I invent a futile dodge. I create a macro on an Excel sheet to hide the fact that the work is tedious, or I cut a corner just to get it off my desk by 5 p.m.
Precisely. True modern invention is not born from desperation or strict necessity. It is born from science. And science is almost wholly the outgrowth of pleasurable intellectual curiosity. It requires that stage of romance we talked about earlier. Therefore, technical education, the training of how to actually do the work, must fundamentally be infused with a liberal spirit.
The text synthesizes this into a sweeping, overarching argument. The antithesis between a technical education and a liberal education is entirely fallacious. They are not opposites at all. They are essential halves of a single, complete whole.
There can be no adequate technical education, which is not liberal, and no liberal education, which is not technical. The intellect does not work best in a vacuum of pure theory. Disinterested scientific curiosity is a wonderful passion for discovering the connection of events, but the ultimate goal of such curiosity must be the marriage of action to thought. This essential intervention of action, even in abstract science, is something that our modern systems often completely overlook.
The book states it so cleanly. Geometry and poetry are as essential as turning lathes. That single sentence captures the entire philosophy. A student must acquire a technique, a science, an assortment of general ideas, and an aesthetic appreciation. And all of these must mutually illuminate one another. Education should turn out a pupil with something they know well and something they can do well. The intimate union of practice and theory aids both.
The stimulation of creative impulse requires a quick transition to practice. Geometry and mechanics must be followed by workshop practice to give physical reality to the abstract concepts. Every curriculum, whether we label it literary, scientific, or technical, must actively include the other elements. A literary curriculum needs the rigorous observation of science. A scientific curriculum needs the aesthetic appreciation of literature. And technical training needs both to elevate it above mere aimless toil.
If true education requires this delicate living balance between thought and immediate practical action, where art and geometry intimately meet the turning lathe, how much of what we call work today has been artificially severed from its intellectual and moral vision? How many of us are trapped doing aimless toil because we've forgotten how to marry our actions to our highest thoughts?
The text quietly suggests that the real challenge before us is not merely reforming the classrooms of our schools. It's ensuring that this rhythm of biological growth, this constant necessary marriage of action and thought, continues unabated into our daily lives and our professions.
And as we sit with that idea, examining the very rhythm of our own intellectual lives, we have to wonder what the next necessary phase of our growth looks like when we step outside the workshop and back into the world.
As we pick up the thread of this thought from the book, if you sit with Alfred North Whitehead's The Aims of Education for just a quiet moment, you start to feel the sheer weight of what he is attempting to dismantle.
You really do. We are returning to a very specific space in his philosophy here.
Right. He is systematically breaking down a wall that most of us, well, we don't even realize it's dictating our lives. It is that massive, seemingly insurmountable divide we have built between intellectual pursuits on one side and manual labor, the actual physical act of making things on the other.
And it is a divide with a very long, very stubborn history. Whitehead points us backward to understand our present, specifically to the post-Renaissance Platonic curriculum, which is a heavy term, I know.
It is a heavy term.
But essentially, it was an educational model that made a devastating error. It decided that pure abstract thought was the realm of the noble and the educated, while physical action was something entirely lesser. It completely severed the mind from the body.
Which is a tragic way to view human potential.
Exactly. Whitehead views this as a disastrous antithesis. When you elevate purely sedentary learning and you disregard technical, hands-on education, you cultivate what he terms the brain lethargy of aristocracies.
Brain lethargy. That is just a haunting phrase. And honestly, it feels eerily relevant to you and me right now. I mean, think about the modern knowledge worker. How many of us spend 8, maybe 10 hours a day moving absolutely nothing but our thumbs on a piece of glass or our fingers on a plastic keyboard? We are completely divorced from the physical friction of making anything tangible.
Yeah, and we end the day exhausted anyway.
Right. But it's a distinct kind of intellectual stagnation.
Yeah.
We're physically rested, but mentally depleted. Whitehead diagnosed this a century ago. He suggests this lethargy happens because the mind isn't just floating in a void behind our eyes. It is inextricably focused in our physical senses, our voice, our ears, and most crucially, our hands.
He actually goes so far as to pose a question that forces you to completely reevaluate the trajectory of human evolution. He asks this simple thing: did the human hand create the human brain, or did the brain create the hand?
It is the ultimate chicken and egg scenario.
It is, but the very fact that the question can be asked highlights how intimate the connection truly is. There is a reciprocal, almost magical influence between the material, creative activity of the hands and the neurological activity of the brain. And this brings us to a rather dangerous reality about modern schooling.
The danger of secondhand knowledge.
Precisely. Whitehead warns that if we rely solely on reading and listening in our schools, we are dealing almost exclusively in secondhand knowledge.
Let me push back on that for just a second, though, because isn't secondhand knowledge basically the entire foundation of civilization? We cannot all individually discover the laws of thermodynamics or the germ theory of disease. How does Whitehead expect a student to function if they have to learn every single thing firsthand? It seems like an impossible standard to set.
Well, it's a fair critique. And to be clear, he isn't suggesting we burn the libraries and start from scratch in the woods.
Right, of course.
What he is critiquing is the learned world's habit of passing around one secondhand scrap of information to illustrate an idea derived from another secondhand scrap without ever actually touching the earth. Purely academic worlds become tame, he argues, because they have, and this is a great quote, they have never been scared by facts.
Never been scared by facts. That paints such a vivid picture.
It does. When you only read about a concept, you receive information that has already been digested by someone else. You are completely shielded from the physical friction of reality. This is exactly why he points to Francis Bacon in the book.
Ah, Francis Bacon.
Yes. We mostly remember Bacon for his theories on inductive reasoning, but his true historical importance, according to Whitehead, was his violent revolt against secondhand information. Bacon demanded that we stop reading Aristotle just to understand nature and start observing nature directly.
And to really grasp the magnitude of Bacon's revolt, we have to look at how Whitehead maps out the architecture of human thought in the book. He divides logical thought into two necessary complementary halves: the logic of discovery and the logic of the discovered.
Right.
The logic of discovery is inductive logic. It is the messy first-hand process. It involves weighing probabilities, discarding irrelevant details, guessing at general rules, and then physically testing those hypotheses. It is getting your hands dirty in the real world.
Yes, and once you discover those rules through that messy process, you must shift gears to the logic of the discovered, which is deductive logic. This is the application of those assumed general laws to specific, special events. One simply cannot exist in a vacuum without the other.
Think about the book's specific example of Isaac Newton for a moment. When Newton divined the law of gravitation, that was a monumental leap of inductive logic. It was pure discovery. But he couldn't just write down a brilliant idea in a notebook and call it a day.
No, the physical world demands proof.
Exactly. To verify his inductive leap, he immediately had to use deductive logic. He had to calculate the Earth's precise gravitational attraction on a falling apple and then apply that exact same deductive calculation to the orbit of the moon. Whitehead describes this beautiful process of ascending from the particular to the general and descending back down to the particular as being like the angels ascending and descending Jacob's ladder.
It's a gorgeous analogy, and if we connect this dance between the general and the particular back to the educational curriculum, we see how it plays out in subjects like mathematics and technical education.
How so?
Well, mathematics is the ultimate exercise in deductive reasoning. It deals in pure, general ideas. An equation like x plus y equals y plus x is an abstract truth. It is pristine, untouched by the messiness of reality. But as Whitehead cautions, if we only teach the abstract, we fail the student entirely.
Because there's no anchor.
Right, the concreteness of technical education is where the power actually lies. That abstract mathematical truth only gains actual importance when you apply it to a concrete reality. You have to recognize that two physical apples combined with two other physical apples make four physical apples.
Which brings us to a rule that feels like the very anchor of his entire philosophy. He says, without generality, there is no reasoning. Without concreteness, there is no importance.
Such a powerful statement.
I want you to really let that sink in. Without concreteness, there is no importance. If you want to genuinely understand anything, you must make it yourself. Passive observation is simply not enough. Your faculties only come alive when an abstract idea is translated into a physical act. You have to feel the limits of your ideas when they finally meet the stubborn resistance of the physical world.
And this realization leads him to envision a much more balanced, holistic architecture for how we shape a human mind. He identifies three main roads we must travel in education: the way of literary culture, the way of scientific culture, and the way of technical culture.
But he issues a severe warning here, doesn't he?
He does. A warning against treating education like a simple recipe. We cannot just throw these three disciplines into a blender. A mere mechanical mixture of these curricula produces nothing but a chaotic jumble of useless scraps of information.
The student never actually integrates them.
Exactly. The challenge is to retain a dominant emphasis for each student, based on their natural inclinations and talents, while seamlessly infusing the other two cultures into that primary path. It has to be an organic synthesis, not a mechanical mixture.
And when he turns his focus specifically to that technical culture, he hones in on a very critical window of time in a student's life, ages 13 to 17. This is that crucial transitional phase when elementary absorption ends and the secondary training begins. But why that specific window? Why is Whitehead so deeply concerned about what we do with 13-year-olds in a workshop?
Because that age is immensely plastic. The brain is forming its long-term habits, and the temptation for society is to exploit that plasticity. He warns against the trap of over-specializing young students. We should not be training a 13-year-old in highly specialized workshop dodges.
Workshop dodges, meaning narrow tricks tailored to just one specific job on an assembly line.
Right. The economic and societal implications of making that mistake are profound. A resilient nation requires what Whitehead calls a fluidity of labor. Workers must possess the intellectual breadth to shift from one allied trade to another as demands change.
Because the economy always changes.
Always. If we lock a young mind into a single, repetitive, mechanical aptitude, we doom them to obsolescence the very moment the economy shifts.
To structure this broader, more resilient kind of training, the book details how Whitehead classifies technical pursuits. He uses a six-fold division based on the dominant science that underpins each pursuit. It's a fascinating way to map out human labor. He categorizes them into geometrical, mechanical, physical, chemical, biological, and commerce or social service techniques.
And the examples he gives clarify this beautifully.
They really do. Carpentry, for instance, is fundamentally a geometrical pursuit. You are manipulating space, measuring angles, understanding structure. Agriculture is deeply biological. You are negotiating constantly with living, breathing systems.
And then you have those wonderfully complex daily activities like cookery. He notes that cooking likely hovers somewhere in the messy intersection of biological, physical, and chemical sciences.
It's applied chemistry you can eat.
Exactly. But the exact classification matters much less than the underlying philosophy here. Every single manual trade is illuminated by a specific scientific reality. By understanding the science, the worker isn't just mindlessly moving their hands in a repetitive motion. They are actively participating in the laws of nature. The physical labor elevates into an intellectual act.
So if manual technical work grounds us in the physical laws of the universe, where does that leave the things we traditionally consider intellectual? Where does literature fit into a mind that is built by the hands?
Well, Whitehead has an absolute disdain for teaching literature merely as an exercise in grammatical study. It infuriates him. He contrasts the Periclean Greeks with the Alexandrian grammarians to make this point.
The builders versus the dissectors.
Exactly. Simply put, the Periclean Greeks were the ones who actually built a vibrant, living culture. They wrote and produced the great, sweeping tragedies and comedies. The Alexandrian grammarians were the academics who showed up centuries later just to dissect the grammar of a dead language. They created nothing new.
This raises a critical point about how we treat our own literature today in schools. Whitehead uses a very striking phrase regarding how we teach Shakespeare. He argues that examining schoolchildren on the minute technical details of Shakespeare's plays inevitably leads to the certain destruction of their enjoyment.
He literally states that this practice should be prosecuted as soul murder.
Soul murder, that is not a quiet term.
No, it's a profound indictment. Literature exists to express the imaginative world within us. It is supposed to move us, to make us feel something deeply. If the student doesn't enjoy it, the educational effort hasn't just fallen short. It has actively caused harm.
I think we all have a very vivid memory of a poem or a novel that was completely ruined for us by a teacher who forced us to deconstruct every single comma until the art was entirely dead on the page.
We all do.
And this naturally leads into Whitehead's thoughts on the necessity of enjoyment. Specifically, the two kinds of intellectual enjoyment he outlines: the enjoyment of creation and the enjoyment of relaxation. In our modern culture of constant hustle and productivity, we often view relaxation as a luxury, or perhaps even a sign of laziness.
But Whitehead presents a rigid, almost cold economic argument against that modern hustle. Sheer relaxation, he argues, is an absolute biological necessity for health.
It's not optional.
Not at all. He points out that if a society or a business tries to speed up production using exhausted, unrefreshed workers, it is a disastrous economic policy. It might yield a temporary spike in output for a quarter or two, but it will inevitably create a generation of worn-out, unemployable citizens that the nation will then have to support for years.
The human body just breaks down.
Yes, we need changes of activity to satisfy the deep cravings of our instincts. While sports offer one vital type of physical relief, art and literature provide a much deeper form of necessary mental relaxation.
And they do much more than just let the tired mind rest. They give the mind vision. The world extends so far beyond our immediate utilitarian senses. Art allows us to perceive those subtle shifts, the quiet pulses of emotion that actually dictate human behavior. Without that vision, cultivated through deliberate relaxation and exposure to art, we cannot effectively direct our practical working lives. We just become machines that eventually grind to a halt.
To drive this point home, he asks us to look backward again to the Benedictine monks during the Dark Ages.
This is such a fascinating historical pivot in the book.
It is. As the Roman world collapsed into chaos, these monks practically saved Western civilization. And they didn't do it by retreating entirely into abstract, pure thought in a locked tower. They survived and preserved culture by inextricably linking together intellectual knowledge, hard physical labor in the fields, and deep moral energy.
They synthesized the three cultures.
They did. They proved that practical affairs are not the kingdom of evil. You don't abandon your ideals to succeed in the practical world. You must actively infuse the practical world with those ideals.
This integration of the practical and the ideal directly informs his rather sobering assessment of the classics in modern education. For centuries, studying Latin and Greek was the undisputed, singular path to being considered an educated person. There were simply no rivals.
But Whitehead uses a slightly tragic, yet very apt metaphor for this shift. He says Humpty Dumpty was a good egg so long as he was on the top of the wall, but you can never set him up again.
The absolute dominance of the classics is gone forever.
It is. It has been replaced by incredibly complex new disciplines, modern sciences, global economics, modern professions, that absolutely demand their own space in the curriculum.
Many classical scholars mourn this deeply, and they often point the finger at modern parents. They complain that parents have become too mercenary, only caring about practical, career-oriented subjects instead of the nobility of Greek philosophy.
And Whitehead gently, but firmly, dismantles this complaint. He points out that parents aren't any more mercenary today than they were in the past. When classics was the sole road to career advancement and lucrative government posts, parents eagerly pushed for classics. It was always about survival and success for their children.
He even adds a wry historical note, reminding us that Aristotle himself, while pondering the infinite cosmos, still believed a good solid income was a highly desirable adjunct to an intellectual life.
Aristotle liked to get paid too.
Exactly. It is a matter of profound practicality, driven by the brutal reality of the calendar. We have to face the statistical fact that the vast majority of pupils, 90% in his estimation at the time, leave school by the age of 18. They will never, ever read a classical book in the original language again.
The window is so narrow.
It is shockingly narrow. The educational system essentially only has 5 years of secondary school life to enrich a child's intellectual character. The sheer lack of time dictates the curriculum. Classics can no longer be defended as a universal requirement. It can only survive if it can prove that it enriches the mind more quickly and effectively than any alternative subject within that brief, fleeting window.
So the burning question becomes, how do we make the absolute most of that short time? How do we get children to truly absorb complex ideas before they are thrust out into the workforce?
This is where Whitehead introduces a philosophy from Sanderson, the late headmaster of Oundle.
Yes. Sanderson said simply, they learn by contact. If you want a child to think clearly, you cannot just cram abstract logical statements into their head.
It just bounces off.
It does. Those abstract statements belong to the grown-up stage of the university. For a young mind, a dense logic textbook has no reference to their individual personal experiences. There is no physical contact with the idea.
To create that vital contact, Whitehead prescribes a very specific, carefully sequenced method for teaching language. He argues that you must start with French, and you must start it as early as humanly possible. But the method is everything here. It must be taught directly, much like a nursery governess would teach it.
You completely immerse the child.
Right. There should be absolutely no intervening English translation between the French words and their meanings. The child must simply live in the French, absorbing the structure of the language subconsciously, just as they did their mother tongue.
The reason for this subconscious absorption is to prepare the ground for what comes next. Once that deep appreciation for language structure is established organically through French, then and only then do you introduce Latin.
But wait, why Latin? I think anyone listening right now might wonder, if the goal is practical education for a modern world and the calendar is already so brutally short, why dedicate precious hours to a dead language?
It's a great question, and it's because of the architectural shock it provides to the mind. He calls Latin the best possible stimulus for mental expansion precisely because of its structural difference.
How different is it, really?
Well, English and French share a relatively common modernity of expression. Their syntax flows in a way that feels familiar to us. Latin is radically different. To an English speaker, the structure of Latin feels almost barbaric. The words stick in the sentences in odd, rigid ways. The verbs are pushed to the end. The cases dictate the meaning regardless of the word order.
That stark contrast is the entire point. Because Latin is so structurally alien, the act of translating an English thought into Latin is no longer just swapping vocabulary words out. It becomes a profound exercise in philosophic logic.
You cannot just translate word for word.
No, you have to completely deconstruct the English thought down to its bare conceptual foundation, and then rebuild it from the ground up using the architecture of Rome. This bridges the gap between simple grammar and deep philosophical instinct. It forces the student to realize that thoughts and words are not the same thing.
It fundamentally changes how you view words themselves. Whitehead leads us to this incredibly deep realization that language is not just a neutral, transparent tool for communication.
It's so much more than that.
It is the actual incarnation of a race's mentality. Every single phrase, every grammatical quirk embodies the habitual ideas of the specific men and women who historically plowed the fields, tended the homes, and built cities of that culture.
Because of this deep cultural embedding, Whitehead asserts that there are actually no true synonyms between words in different languages. The historical baggage, the cultural cargo is always uniquely different. The environment that shaped the word fundamentally shapes the mind that uses it.
This brings us to a historical concept in the book that is entirely mesmerizing. Whitehead describes the Roman Empire as the bottleneck of history.
A bottleneck.
Yes, think about the physical image of a bottleneck. All the vintage of the ancient, troubled past, the philosophy of Greece, the endless conflicts of the Mediterranean, the ancient racial wanderings, all of it poured into this narrow Roman bottleneck. It was pressurized there, codified, and then flowed out to shape all of European civilization and modern life.
Focused history.
It did. To truly understand the tides of change in human affairs, you cannot just read dry diplomatic correspondence or memorize lists of dates. You must make direct contact with the mentality of Rome. And the only way to genuinely touch that ancient mentality is through the language of Rome itself.
It is a staggering thought to hold in your mind. If it is true, if a language perfectly incarnates the habitual ideas and the very soul of the people who forged it over centuries, I want you to consider your own daily life right now. Think about our modern language. Think about the fragmented, hyper-fast, perpetually abbreviated way we communicate with each other today across screens and servers. If our language is the blueprint of our consciousness, what does our modern fragmented language say about the architecture of our own minds today?
And that brings us right into this really fascinating pivot Alfred North Whitehead makes here in the Aims of Education. We've been sitting here with the text open, tracing his thoughts on how classical subjects fit into a modern curriculum, and we arrive at this very specific, almost radical transition point. Before he moves into the mathematical sciences, he sets up what he calls the essential triangle of literary culture. He builds this triangle out of English, French, and Latin. And his argument is that acquiring French and Latin is the most accessible, historically tested mode for a student to make contact with the philosophy of logic and the philosophy of history.
It is a really striking geometric metaphor to use for language. He looks at this triangle and suggests that one pair of these vertices, English and French, gives us the diverse expressions of the modern mindset. But that third point, Latin, acts as our anchor. It shows us the alternative processes of derivation from the Mediterranean civilization of the past. It contains within itself the freshness of contrast, holding the present and the past in a kind of tension. And it's important to clarify here, for you listening and perhaps thinking it sounds incredibly rigid, that Whitehead doesn't view this as the absolute singular path for every single mind.
Right. He explicitly acknowledges a large minority of students for whom the emphasis
Should be different, yes. But he does believe this specific route offers the greatest success for the largest majority. It's the foundation of a literary education that has actually survived the grueling test of historical experience.
He really respects its historical weight, but that is exactly what makes his actual critique of Roman literature in the book so startling. I mean, you expect him to revere the Latin texts, but he is incredibly blunt. He essentially asks you, the reader, who in their right mind would ever trade foundational philosophers like Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, or John Locke for a Roman orator like Cicero? Or, if you want to reflect on the infinite variety of human existence, would you ever swap literary giants like Shakespeare or Dickens for Roman playwrights like Terence or Plautus?
It's a brutal assessment.
It really is. He argues Roman literature severely lacks outstanding genius. He says there is very little aloofness about its authors. They are uniquely bound by their own race and their limitations.
He is wonderfully unsentimental about the Romans. With the rare exception of a philosopher-poet like Lucretius, he points out that Roman authors simply do not possess that universal transcendent quality we find in Greek or English literature. He looks at the historian Tacitus, for example, and describes him as being blinded by the limitations of the diehards of the Roman Senate. Tacitus was so obsessed with the political squabbles in the capital that he was completely unable to see the actual magnificent achievements of Roman provincial administration happening all around him.
Missing the forest for the trees, essentially.
Very much so. Roman literature, Whitehead notes rather wryly, can hardly laugh, and it can hardly cry. It lacks the deep, subtle, universal human feeling that makes English literature so profoundly rich. Very little of Roman literature, he remarks, will find its way into the kingdom of heaven.
Which naturally makes you wonder, if the literature itself lacks this universal genius, if it isn't inherently profound in the way we usually demand of the classics, why is Latin sitting at that foundational vertex of his educational triangle? Why is it so strictly crucial?
Because Latin has exactly one profound theme, and that theme is Rome itself. Rome is the mother of Europe. To understand why that matters, Whitehead draws its incredibly vivid picture of how Roman civilization appeared to the early Christians. He quotes the haunting imagery of the apocalypse from the book of Revelation, painting Rome as the great Babylon.
Right, he describes the merchants of the earth standing afar off.
Yes, weeping and mourning over her destruction, because no man buys their merchandise anymore. Their gold, silver, precious stones, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet. That imagery isn't just a poetic flourish. It illustrates the sheer, overwhelming economic and physical scale of Rome. We inherit the dual aspect of the civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean, and understanding Rome exhibits the geography of Europe and the very foundations of Western culture. It's about feeling the weight of that history.
And that ties directly into his underlying philosophy regarding what he calls the sense of greatness. He makes the claim that moral education is essentially impossible without a habitual vision of greatness.
The true merit of studying Rome in the education of youth is its absolute concreteness. It provides an immediate intuition of greatness, which he calls the groundwork of morals. It's an inspiration to action. Even when the Romans sin, as Whitehead phrases it, they had the saving merit of sinning with cart ropes.
That is such a specific image, pulling their sins along like massive wagons.
Exactly. It's a reference to the book of Isaiah, meaning their transgressions weren't petty. Their aims were massive, their virtues were grand, and their vices were equally colossal. If a curriculum fails to hold this grand, sweeping drama before the youth, if it fails to provide that habitual vision of greatness, it fails morally. The sense of greatness isn't the conclusion of a logical argument you can just write on a chalkboard. It's an immediate intuition that a student has to feel.
But then we run into the practical reality of the classroom, which is where his philosophy hits the ground and where things usually fall apart. The book addresses this deeply. The twin problems of scale and pace when trying to teach this vision of greatness. He uses this incredibly powerful analogy, warning against examining St. Peter's Basilica in Rome with a microscope.
It is a brilliant way to frame the fundamental failure of modern classical education. He extends that architectural analogy to the reading of literature. Imagine forcing a student to read Homer's Odyssey at an agonizing pace of 5 lines a day, constantly pausing to reference a dictionary for grammar and syntax. The art collapses entirely.
It goes from being a majestic epic to a rubbish heap.
A rubbish heap of disconnected words, yes. You completely lose the vision of Rome, the vast scale set in the history of all time, when you are bogged down in microscopic grammatical details.
It's the exact reason so many of us hated Shakespeare in high school, isn't it? Spending 3 weeks agonizing over the syntax of a single soliloquy until the actual emotion of the play is completely dead.
That is precisely the phenomenon he's describing. The psychological reasoning here is critical. Students need to grasp the unity of a whole piece first. Every poem, every epic is meant to be read within certain limits of time. The contrasts, the imagery, the transition of moods, these correspond to the sway of rhythms in the human spirit. And those rhythms simply refuse to be stretched beyond certain limits. If you drag a poem out over a semester, you kill the rhythm.
Which is why he mounts a somewhat controversial defense of using literary translations. He humorously notes that suggesting this to some traditional scholars is like introducing a nasty sex problem into decent company.
They are horrified by the idea of not reading the original text.
Right. But Whitehead argues that common sense dictates we should procure the best literary translations available, ones that preserve the charm and vigor of the original so the student can actually experience the pacing of the story.
Only after the whole has been appreciated at the proper pace should the original Latin be introduced. and even then, sparingly. You use it just to illuminate the author's exact phrasing in key moments. He boldly compares classical scholars who obsess over grammar to scientists who, to borrow a phrase from Wordsworth, murder to dissect. They become veritable assassins of beauty. The total bulk of Latin literature needed to truly convey the vision of Rome is far greater than what any student can possibly accomplish translating by hand.
To understand Rome, they need to read more Virgil, more Lucretius, more history, and more Cicero than they could ever translate themselves in a lifetime of schooling.
Precise.
This urgent need for scale and concreteness completely reshapes how he believes history should be taught, too. He insists on moving away from generalized statements and dry political chronicles, the memorization of dates and kings. Instead, the book advocates for using physical models, photographs, casts of statues, and pictures from vases. He suggests historians should imitate the procedure of zoologists.
Yes. Think about how zoologists teach. They demonstrate typical examples of animal creation. Historians must do the same with human history. We have to get into the students' minds exactly how men alter their physical realities, their appearances, their dwellings, their technology, their art, and their religious beliefs. Because, as Whitehead synthesizes so beautifully, human life is fundamentally founded on technology, science, art, and religion. All four are inextricably interconnected.
You cannot understand any social organization without referencing those underlying factors.
Exactly. Just as ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt were made possible by the technology of irrigation, the Roman Empire existed by virtue of the grandest application of technology the world had hitherto seen. Its roads, its bridges, its aqueducts, tunnels, sewers, and its metallurgy.
And this brings us to one of the most fascinating thought experiments in the entire book, the Roman steam engine. He marvels at the fact that the Romans possessed this vast, highly organized network of technology and advanced metallurgy. So he asked the obvious question. Why didn't the Roman engineers invent the steam engine? They had the skill, they could have done it at any time, and if they had, it would have entirely altered the trajectory of human history.
A masterful piece of historical deduction. He quietly walks you through the reality of their daily physical environment. He ascribes the lack of a steam engine simply to the fact that the Romans lived in a warm climate and hadn't introduced tea and coffee to their culture.
It sounds almost absurd at first, blaming the lack of an industrial revolution on a lack of tea.
It does, but think about the alternative. Unlike the 18th century British engineers who sat by their firesides in a cold, damp climate, staring at kettles boiling for their daily tea, Roman engineers lacked that humble, daily visual stimulus of steam power. The motive force of steam pushing the lid off a kettle wasn't a constant domestic presence in their lives. The environment simply didn't present the phenomenon to them in a way that demanded their attention.
It's almost like giving someone from the 1800s a modern smartphone, but they only ever use it as a flashlight. Not because they aren't smart enough to use the other features, but because they don't have the environment, the cell towers, the internet, to even conceive of what else it could do.
That is a perfect modern parallel. And this connects to a much broader sociological point Whitehead makes. Novelty slowly seeps into a social system. It doesn't explode all at once. Look at the invention of writing. It took centuries to shift from mere governmental record-keeping, counting grain and taxes, to becoming a vehicle for individual, novel thought in the hands of the Greeks and Hebrews. Technological paradigms don't shift overnight. They require a subtle, pervasive stimulus from the environment to trigger that leap of imagination.
That idea of needing the right environment to see the obvious, like the boiling water for the steam engine, applies perfectly to Whitehead's biggest gripe with how we teach mathematics. Let's smoothly turn the page here into Chapter 6, the mathematical curriculum. We put students in an intellectual vacuum, totally divorced from their environment. He argues that education cannot exist in that vacuum. It has to be relevant to the modern intellectual atmosphere.
Any serious fundamental change in the intellectual outlook of human society must be followed by an educational revolution. If society changes how it understands the world, the classroom must reflect that. And here, he identifies the primary villain in how mathematics is traditionally taught. He calls it reconditeness.
Reconditeness. It's a heavy, archaic-sounding word, and he spends a good amount of time unpacking it. When I first read it, my immediate thought was just, oh, he means the math is too hard. But it is actually much more insidious than that, isn't it?
Far more insidious. He is very careful to clarify that recondite doesn't merely mean extremely difficult. Rather, it refers to ideas of highly special application that rarely influence broad, general thought. It's the deduction of innumerable hyperspecific results from general ideas, where each new result is more obscure and further removed from reality than the preceding one. He argues that this liability to reconditeness destroys the utility of mathematics in a liberal education.
So it's like learning the grammatical exceptions of a dead language instead of learning how to speak it.
Precisely. To summarize the general judgment of mankind regarding this kind of math, Whitehead uses the Latin phrase securus judicat orbis terrarum.
Let's pause on that. What is the exact translation of that phrase?
It translates roughly to the verdict of the world is secure, or the judgment of the whole world is safe. He is saying that the general consensus of ordinary people is actually correct here. Math, as it exists in the minds of most students, is hopelessly isolated from ordinary thought. The boundless wealth of deductions bewilders the average pupil, offering no apparent relevance to the great ideas that shape our world.
You can see the modern parallels so clearly here. Think about how we structure advanced placement classes or standardized tests today. We're often just forcing kids to cram obscure theorems and formulas that they will forget the moment the exam is over, rather than teaching them how mathematical thinking applies to their actual lives.
That aimless accumulation of special mathematical theorems is exactly what he warns against. The reform he proposes is incredibly grounding. He states that mathematics, for the general student, should simply consist of the relations of number, the relations of quantity, and the relations of space. That is it.
And the pedagogical method, the way we actually teach those relations, is crucial to making this work. He insists we must proceed from the particular to the general. Children should learn through simple, concrete examples first. Only later, after years of practical work, should there be a final recognition that these preceding years have actually illustrated fundamental mathematical relations.
Bookwork shouldn't really test a student's ability to cram obscure facts. It should be a direct illustration of broad, profound ideas. He notes a very common mistaken idea in education, that complicated problem papers test true ability or genius. More often than not, they just test a student's capacity for cramming.
He actually points out that only boys who have been specially crammed for scholarships can ever do those traditional convoluted problem papers successfully. It's an artificial skill. Instead of that aimless accumulation, he argues that the final stage of mathematical education needs to focus heavily on the integration of physics. The mathematical ideas must be shown as the precise formulation of mechanical laws.
The physical laboratory and the mathematical ideas must constantly illustrate each other. Mathematical ideas are essential for formulating precise laws of nature, and when a student sees that, the role of abstract thought becomes practically apparent to them. To illustrate how badly we've failed at this, he points out a grave error in traditional schooling, the total omission of Euclid's fifth book.
He spends significant time praising that specific text. Why is Euclid's fifth book so critical to his argument?
Because Euclid's fifth book deals directly with the philosophy and the fundamental properties of quantity and numerical measurement. Before you could use math, you have to understand what you are quantifying. Things like temperature, heat, mass, distance, and even abstract concepts like pleasure and pain. By skipping these foundational ideas of quantity and rushing kids straight into algebra, forcing them to solve for x without understanding what x represents in the physical world, we strip math of its connection to reality. Nothing, he says, can be more characteristic of the hopelessly illiberal character of traditional mathematical education than the fact that this foundational book on quantity has always been omitted.
That disconnect from reality is so evident when he transitions into talking about functionality and graphs. He points out that we've had a great reform in recent years in teaching children to draw graphs, which sounds like a step in the right direction, but it is not enough to just plot points and draw a curve on a piece of paper. The student must understand the idea behind the graph. He equates it to understanding the man behind the gun. At present, there is a tendency to just set children to draw curves and leave the whole question of what those curves actually represent entirely alone.
Because a graph isn't just a shape, it is a visual representation of a physical law. Take the inverse square law, for example. The idea that something like light or gravity gets exponentially weaker the further away you get from its source. If you graph that, you get a very specific curve. The curve tells a story about the physical universe. And this leads quietly to his most radical suggestion for the curriculum. He advocates for introducing the differential calculus to young students.
That sounds terrifying to most people. Calculus is treated as the ultimate gatekeeper of high-level math.
It is treated that way, but he argues there is absolutely nothing particularly difficult about the core conception of calculus. At its heart, Differential calculus is simply the study of a rate of change. It's understanding how fast something is changing at any given moment, like a car accelerating or a population growing. Differentiating simple powers of x, or even basic geometry like sine and cosine, could easily be taught to younger students. The barrier isn't that the concept of a rate of change is too difficult for a teenager to grasp. The barrier is our fatal habit of cramming children with those obscure recondite theorems they do not understand and will never use.
We clutter the path so much that they never reach the clearing.
Exactly. If we abandon the cramming of trivia, we suddenly have plenty of time to concentrate their attention on the really important topics, giving them familiarity with the grand conceptions that truly influence human thought and shape the physical world.
It is a remarkable thread that ties all of this together. Whether we are looking at the vastness of the Roman Empire and the way we teach its literature, or the foundational concepts of mathematics and physics, the core message is identical. We have to clear away the obscure, microscopic trivia in both language and math to reveal the grand, simple structures underneath. We have to stop examining the majestic structures of human knowledge with a microscope and start looking at the profound, moving forces that actually shape our world and our intellect.
Which leaves us with a rather vital question to sit with as we process his arguments. If our educational systems today are still so heavily built on testing recondite details, the very aimless cramming for standardized tests that Whitehead warned against over a century ago, what modern Roman steam engines might our current students be failing to invent simply because their curriculum isn't allowing them the freedom to notice the water boiling right in front of them? And as we trace this thread further into the book, we find ourselves at this really quiet but sweeping threshold.
Yeah, we are moving away from the specific granular architecture of that mathematical curriculum we were just looking at.
Right, stepping directly into the philosophical center of the university itself.
Is a delicate transition the text makes here, stepping back from the classroom to look at the entire architecture of human thought.
So if you are sitting with us right now in this quiet space, our mission for this segment is to understand precisely how logical method is formed in the human mind through mathematics.
And subsequently, how that exact process dictates whether a university can keep the sheer zest of life alive in modern society.
To grasp the foundation of this, we first have to unpack that concept of logical method. It is a phrase that carries a lot of baggage. I mean, you might naturally assume that developing a logical method means practicing formal, valid reasoning.
Right, you picture someone learning to construct a neat syllogism.
Exactly, that classic logical structure where if A equals B and B equals C, then A must equal C.
But the book asks us to look much further back to our biological roots. The human mind was not evolved in bygone ages for the sake of abstract reasoning.
Which is a rather humbling image.
It is. Our brains evolved simply to enable mankind to hunt with more art between meals.
I love that phrasing. It suggests that sustained close reasoning is just not our default state.
No, not at all. Because our primitive wiring is entirely oriented toward immediate physical survival, sitting down to follow a long, unbroken chain of deductions goes completely against our nature.
Very few people can do it without immense practice.
And acknowledging that biological limitation is crucial. Because we're not naturally wired for sustained abstract deduction, the art of being a good reasoner requires something else.
The text proposes that a true reasoner is not someone who memorizes 1,000 logical steps, but rather someone who gets hold of a subject at the right end.
They seize upon a few general illuminating ideas and they hold on to them. The phrasing used is like grim death.
Like grim death, right? You hold those central ideas and you marshal all the subsidiary scattered facts around them.
That is the essence of it.
I want to pause on how we actually train a mind to do that, to seize those central ideas. The book makes a definitive claim that to build this logical method, geometry is a far superior training ground compared to algebra.
Which surprises a lot of people.
Yeah, why geometry over algebra? Doesn't algebra teach exactly that kind of rigorous step-by-step logical deduction?
It does, but algebra operates in a field of thought that is profoundly obscure to the developing mind.
It is just manipulating symbols.
Right. You are following arbitrary rules that can feel completely divorced from the physical world. Geometry, on the other hand, deals with the obvious, insistent reality of physical space.
It is evident to everyone who opens their eyes.
Exactly. When you study geometry, you are engaging in the most vital process of abstraction.
You learn to look at a physical object and mentally strip away all of its irrelevant properties.
You put aside its color, its taste, its weight, and you focus purely on its fundamental relations in space. This process of spatial abstraction is an education in itself.
The reasoning is guided by clear, well-marked ideas that have immediate physical exemplifications. That makes a lot of sense. You are teaching the mind to find the underlying structure of reality without getting lost in algebraic symbols.
And to build this foundation, the book outlines 5 distinct sequential stages of geometry that belong in a liberal education.
Starting with the first stage, which focuses on the study of congruence.
Congruence is defined here as the invariable correlation of 2 regions of space point by point.
We intuitively grasp this when we use a physical tool, right, like a yardstick.
Yes, but the text asks you to realize that a yardstick is just a practical, everyday device for this much deeper concept of congruence.
It is this fundamental correlation that allows us to understand the elementary properties of triangles, parallelograms, and circles.
And the advice is to keep the number of proved propositions in this first stage to an absolute minimum, focusing only on those foundational concepts.
Once a student understands how regions of space correlate, the curriculum takes them next to similarity.
If congruence is an exact one-to-one mapping, similarity is essentially an enlargement of that idea. It is still a correlation of points in space, but it is scaled.
And the practical application of similarity seems incredibly immediate. This is the mathematics that allows human beings to create plans and maps.
It is the foundation of scale.
Right. If you understand similarity, you understand how a small architectural drawing sitting on a desk perfectly correlates to a massive building. It grounds the abstract math directly into the physical world you navigate every day.
It does, and that grounding is essential. But as we move into the third stage, which is the study of trigonometry, the text takes a fiercely critical turn.
This is where the critique of standard education becomes quite sharp. There's an intense disdain in these pages for how trigonometry is usually taught.
Particularly the reliance on memorizing an endless list of formulae. The argument is that trigonometry should focus strictly on periodicity, rotation, and wave motion.
The text advocates for the rigorous exclusion of the vast wealth of formulae that crowd modern textbooks.
They are viewed as entirely useless for this type of liberal study. The author specifically points out the addition formulae for sine and cosine as something to be excluded.
There is a specific anecdote mentioned in American College where students were expected to know by heart 90 different formulae in trigonometry alone.
Which is an unfortunate ideal.
There's a quiet tragedy in that image. 90 disconnected equations memorized by rote, completely divorced from the reality they describe.
It is mindless memorization, the exact opposite of logical method. It kills the intellectual curiosity.
Because if you burden a student with 90 formulas, they're no longer seizing a few illuminating ideas and holding on to them.
They are just carrying rocks.
Instead, the focus should be restricted to graphing functions, solving triangles, and understanding the core phenomena of surveying and wave motion.
Let them see how math maps the rhythm of the ocean or the cycle of the seasons.
That stripping away of the unnecessary continues right into the fourth stage, analytical geometry.
The book advocates for a meticulously pruned course focusing on the straight line, the circle, and the 3 types of conic sections defined by their algebraic equations.
But again, there's a very specific cutting critique regarding how conics are taught. The call is to completely sweep away geometrical conics as a separate, isolated subject.
To understand this critique, we should clarify what that traditional method looks like. The book specifically takes aim at defining a conic section by the focus and directrix property.
Often represented by the algebraic formula, SP equals E times PM.
Can you unpack why that specific formula draws such ire? To put that formula in perspective for you, it is a highly abstract way of calculating the distance between a focal point, a specific point on a curve, and a straight line.
It is mathematically elegant to a professional.
But the text calls this definition hopelessly recondite and thoroughly bad for a student.
Because it has no obvious importance to a young mind learning to reason.
Exactly. Why should a 15-year-old care about drawing a curve defined by this obscure specific ratio over an infinite number of other arbitrary algebraic formula?
It just clutters the mind with abstractions that have no anchor in their lived experience.
It completely misses the aim of education, which is to illuminate the mind, not weigh it down.
Which leads us to the fifth and final stage of this mathematical foundation, projective geometry.
Centering on concepts like cross ratio and projection. Projective geometry, simply put, is the geometry of shadows and perspective.
It is the study of what properties of a figure remain invariant when you project it onto a different plane.
And hidden within this stage is a beautiful philosophy about how human beings actually learn. The text introduces the idea of the psychological simplification of proof.
Which is contrasted with logical simplification. I find that distinction deeply fascinating.
Logically speaking, the most general abstract case of a mathematical theorem is usually the simplest to prove because it relies on the absolute fewest assumptions.
But psychologically, that general case is almost always the hardest for a student to grasp.
Because the general case lacks familiar details. Projective geometry allows you to prove the most familiar or the easiest case first.
You start with a shape or a projection that the student can easily visualize in their mind's eye.
Once they grasp the familiar case, you project that understanding outward into the abstract. You honor the psychology of the learner.
So mapping out these 5 stages, congruence, similarity, trigonometry, analytical, and projective geometry, it becomes clear that this curriculum is not about creating human calculators.
The goal is to train the mind in logical method, to equip a person with the precise structural ideas that lie at the very base of all scientific and philosophical investigations of the universe.
Mathematics, when pruned of its rote memorization and taught organically, becomes the scaffolding for understanding reality itself.
And having built that scaffolding, having established how a mind ought to be trained to seize big ideas, the book seamlessly transitions into its 7th chapter.
Moving from the individual mind to the institution. Having defined the trained mind, it asks the ultimate societal question. What then is the true function of a university?
It is a question that forces us to look backward at history to understand our present. The text points out a glaring, undeniable fact.
Ever since the popularization of the printing press, the university has had absolutely no justification for existing if its only purpose is to impart information.
Because books are cheap. They are everywhere.
If a person simply needs to acquire facts, they can go to a library and read.
Precisely. And furthermore, if the goal is merely practical job training, the historical system of apprenticeship is well understood and highly effective. You learn a trade by doing the trade.
So if the university is not fundamentally about distributing information, and it is not about mere vocational training, what is its purpose in the modern era?
The definition the book provides is profoundly beautiful. The justification for a university is that it preserves the connection between knowledge and the zest of life.
It does this by uniting the young and the old in the imaginative consideration of learning. The university imparts information, yes, but it imparts it imaginatively.
That word imaginatively is the fulcrum of this entire philosophy.
I want to linger on that word. What does it actually mean to impart information imaginatively?
It means that in a true university, a fact is no longer just a bare inert fact. It is invested with all its possibilities.
It ceases to be a heavy burden on the memory and instead becomes energizing.
The text offers a profound comparison here. Fools act on imagination without knowledge, while pedants act on knowledge without imagination.
Let's explore that comparison for a moment and connect it to our own lives. We all likely encountered both types.
The fool who is full of wild imaginative ideas but lacks the structural knowledge to execute them safely or effectively.
And on the other end, the pedant. The pedant is perhaps the more tragic figure in modern society.
This is the person who holds an immense amount of knowledge, who knows all the facts and the procedures, but lacks the imagination to apply them in new ways, to adapt or to see the human element within the data.
The monumental task of a university is to weld those two forces together, to create individuals who have both the rigorous knowledge of reality and the imagination to reshape it.
To ground this high philosophy in the practical world, the book points to what was at the time of writing a relatively new phenomenon: the modern business school.
Specifically noting the historical context of the foundation of the business school at Harvard. It might seem strange that a philosophical text on education focuses so heavily on a business school.
But modern business is viewed here as the perfect, most complex example of this need for imagination. Business is no longer a simple local transaction.
Trading a sheep for a sack of grain.
Far from it. If you are organizing a modern global corporation, the text argues that you need an incredibly imaginative grasp of the world.
You need to understand geography not just as lines on a map, but as population scattered across mountains and plains.
You need to grasp political economy, applied science, and the intricate laws of human health and fatigue.
And perhaps most importantly, to run a complex organization, you need a sympathetic, imaginative vision of human nature to understand what evokes the psychology of loyalty.
You cannot manage people effectively with bare facts alone.
And this is where the text identifies a profound danger in modern society and why the university's role is so incredibly critical.
When young people leave their education and enter these massive corporations, they do not start as visionary leaders.
They enter doing fixed routine tasks. They start at the bottom.
And while that routine builds a certain reliability of character, prolonged, unbroken routine inevitably dulls the imagination.
It turns the mind rigid.
The university must provide the imaginative foundation, the intellectual adventure, before the student is swallowed by the necessary routine of the practical world.
If the university fails to provide that imaginative foundation beforehand, it has failed entirely. But this raises a mechanical question. How does an institution actually foster this?
The book uses a very vivid metaphor to explain the transmission of this quality. It says that imagination is a contagious disease.
It is a striking image. Imagination cannot be measured by the yard or weighed by the pound and then simply distributed to the students in a lecture hall.
It can only be communicated by a faculty whose members themselves wear their learning with imagination.
It is passed like a lighted torch from hand to hand down the generations.
To keep that torch burning, the text addresses the eternal structural debate within universities, the balance between research and teaching.
The solution proposed is organic, recognizing how the two functions must feed each other. The logic is cyclical.
Do you want your teachers to be imaginative? You must encourage them to research to push the boundaries of what is known.
Do you want your researchers to remain imaginative and not become isolated pedants?
You must bring them into direct contact with eager young students who question their assumptions.
But this organic, contagious spread of imagination is deeply threatened by how modern institutions measure success.
The book goes into immense detail warning against the tendency to measure a faculty's worth strictly by their printed papers.
What we commonly refer to today as the publish or perish culture.
The text notes that some of the most fertile, imaginative minds find the physical composition of writing to be almost impossible.
Their brilliance lies in conversation, in the spark of interaction, not in producing volumes of text.
There is a magnificent historical example brought up to illustrate this point. Socrates.
The text frames Socrates as an immortal, unthanked benefactor of humanity.
His mind and his method of questioning shaped the entire course of Western thought through his intellectual descendants. And yet, Socrates never published a single word.
If Socrates were judged by the strict modern metric of printed output, he would be denied tenure. He would be considered an institutional failure.
Therefore, the book insists that the output of a university must be estimated in the weight of thought, not in the sheer number of words printed in academic journals.
Which leads to a profound structural distinction between managing a university and managing a commercial business.
You simply cannot govern a faculty of scholars using the rules, metrics, and policies of a familiar business corporation.
You cannot hire thinkers for legal services under strict, rigid conditions of time and expect a torch of imagination to be lit.
If you try to manage a university like a factory, treating the professors like efficient cogs in an assembly line, what is the result?
You will succeed only in creating a faculty of efficient pedants and dullards.
And the tragedy is the general public might not even notice the difference for years. The institution will still produce papers and grant degrees.
But the fundamental promise of youth, that imaginative zest, will have been stunted.
A true university requires freedom from restraint, freedom from harassing worry, and the space for the excitement of curiosity to breathe.
And history quietly bears this out. The book reflects softly on the legacies of institutions that, despite their flaws, managed to preserve this imaginative quest.
It speaks of the University of Paris and the University of Oxford. The reflection on Oxford is particularly poignant.
It acknowledges that Oxford has sinned in many ways throughout its long history.
But for all her deficiencies, she preserved the supreme merit of treating learning imaginatively.
The text suggests that for that achievement alone, anyone who loves culture must view her with profound emotion. The gaze then shifts across the ocean to America.
It points to Thomas Jefferson framing his founding of the University of Virginia as one of the greatest achievements of his complex genius.
An institution explicitly designed to stimulate the imagination.
And it points to the Puritan roots of Harvard, built on the ideals of confronting the confusion of present times with intellectual courage.
These historical examples serve as a quiet, powerful reminder of what learning is actually for. It is never simply about filling a ledger with data.
It is about keeping the human mind alive, agile, and imaginative in the face of an increasingly complex and routine-driven world.
As we pause our exploration of the text right here, we invite you to sit quietly with this idea. Look closely at your own daily rhythms. Consider the tasks that occupy your hours. How much of your current daily work is acting as a prolonged routine, slowly dulling your own imagination? And more importantly, how might you begin to weld your own practical, hard-earned experience with a renewed imaginative zest for life? Hold softly onto that question as we carry this forward.
As we just settle back into the quiet space we've been building here, picking up exactly where we left off in our journey,
Right.
I want you to just take a breath. Just let the noise of the day fall away for a moment. We are currently right in the middle, the seventh part, of our 10-part continuous exploration of Alfred North Whitehead's book.
Specifically his thoughts on the organization of thought and, well, the historical aims of education.
Exactly. And our mission for this quiet hour is to uncover something that is quite startling when you really look at it. We want to explore how we as humans take the completely chaotic, untidy, overwhelming mess of raw sensory
The
experience.
pure noise of existing.
Yes, the noise. How we take that and somehow organize it into the incredibly sharp, precise frameworks that we call science and logic. And crucially, how we manage to do that without ever losing the necessary spark of human imagination.
It's a beautiful thread to continue with you,
Yep.
because what is truly mesmerizing about Whitehead's approach here is that it doesn't begin with, dry equations or cold abstract rules.
No, it doesn't.
It begins with the human spirit. It begins with history. If we look closely at the evolution of thought, we really have to pause and reflect on the Puritans of the 17th and 18th centuries.
Which feels like a strange place to start a discussion on science, for most people.
It does. We so often picture them as these austere, rigid figures, completely devoid of color or joy. But the reality of the book's observation is that they were intensely, almost violently imaginative people.
Right.
They were highly restrained in their outward expression, true. They were almost fearful of the symbolism found in physical beauty. But internally, their minds were an absolute furnace. They were just racked with the intensity of spiritual truths that they intellectually imagined.
Let's unpack that slowly, because that internal fire didn't just extinguish when the culture eventually changed. It transformed, didn't it?
Precisely. That Puritan imagination was incredibly potent. And over time, as that rigid outward austerity softened, it paved the way for the golden literary age in New England.
You had figures like Emerson, Lowell, and Longfellow setting their indelible mark upon institutions like Harvard.
And from there, that same underlying inherited imaginative spirit evolved once again into the modern scientific age, perfectly captured by the work of someone like William James. What we are witnessing here is the direct lineage of the modern imaginative scholar.
And this brings us to a rather profound realization about the modern relationship between the university and the practical commercial world.
Today, business comes to the university. And the greatest gift which the university has to offer is not merely technical skill or a memorized list of facts. It is that old, inherited gift of imagination.
The book describes it beautifully as a lighted torch passed from hand to hand.
It does. Now, it is a dangerous gift. Imagination has started many a conflagration throughout history. But if society is timid about that danger, the proper course would simply be to shut down our universities entirely.
I have to pause you there, though. We so often think of imagination as something totally opposed to commerce or practical everyday business.
The starving artist versus the CEO.
Exactly. How does this lighted torch of imagination actually survive in the cold, hard world of commerce?
Well, it doesn't just survive, it thrives alongside it.
Mm.
If you look at the great commercial peoples of history, commerce and imagination are deeply intertwined. We see it with ancient Greece, with Florence, with Venice,
The immense learning of Holland during its golden age of trade.
and the poetry of England. There is an incredible ideal regarding Athens that Whitehead quotes, which captures this perfectly. Her citizens, imperial spirits, rule the present from the past.
Imagination allows a commercial society to see beyond the immediate transaction and build something enduring.
It is the only way to build something enduring.
So if we have this raw, fiery imagination, how does it translate into tangible, lasting progress? This brings us to the core of what we are unraveling today, the organization of thought.
Because organized thought is the absolute foundation of organized action.
There's a gorgeous comparison used here involving an epic poem. I want you to think about what an epic poem actually is. It is a monumental triumph of organization.
It really is.
It takes a multitude of sounds, pictorial memories of diverse events, and deeply random feelings that ordinarily just wash over us in life, and it weaves them together deliberately. It arranges them to excite emotions which are simple, sensuous, and passionate.
But science is an organization of a very definite, specific type. The number of successful epic poems in human history is immensely small because the task of organizing human emotion is so profoundly difficult. Science, on the other hand, organizes our physical reality.
And the book describes science as a river fed by two distinct sources, the practical source and the theoretical source.
Right. The practical source is our fundamental desire to direct our actions to achieve predetermined ends. Think of a grounded historical example. A British nation fighting a brutal war for justice, turning to science to understand the vital importance of the compounds of nitrogen to create explosives or fertilizers. That is science driven by an immediate, visceral, practical need.
Wait, I have to challenge that balance for a moment. If there are two sources, the practical and the theoretical, isn't the practical application inherently more urgent and therefore more important?
It seems that way.
If I need nitrogen to win a war and save my country, isn't that a far nobler pursuit than just sitting around in a laboratory theorizing about the nature of atoms?
It is a very natural assumption to make, but it is one the text forcefully rejects. Neither of these sources is inherently nobler than the other.
Really?
Yes, it is not intrinsically more noble to strive to understand the universe theoretically than it is to busy oneself with ordering physical actions correctly. Both have profound value, and critically, both have their dark sides.
Ah, right. We can use practical action for incredibly evil ends.
And there can be deeply ignoble, destructive curiosities in our theoretical pursuits. Both sources exist in all of us.
So why does the theoretical side matter to you, the listener, when we have so many immediate, pressing problems to solve in the real world today?
Because action must be immediate. It takes place under circumstances that are excessively complicated. If a society waits to arrange its ideas peacefully only after a crisis hits, well, in peace we lose our trade, and in war we lose the battle.
A true theorist isn't someone merely sitting up in the clouds, totally detached from the physical world.
Precisely. A successful theorist is a person whose motive for thought is the absolute desire to formulate correctly the rules according to which events occur. They must be obsessively interested in immediate events. Otherwise, they are unlikely to formulate anything accurate about them.
Success in practice depends entirely on theorists who have explored the territory beforehand, mapped the unseen roads, and hit upon the relevant ideas before the crisis ever arrives.
Which naturally leads us into the fascinating and, frankly, deeply unsettling way science actually looks at the world.
You know, early science just assumed that nature was filled with obvious, self-evident concepts, things like life, heredity, material bodies, molecules, atoms, space, and time.
They thought they simply woke up, looked around, and nature handed them a neat, organized catalog of the universe.
They thought the conceptual work was already done by nature itself. But think about how you actually experience the world. You don't wake up and see a neat collection of atoms.
No, you do not. This is a profound shift in perspective. The actual starting ground of science is not a neat collection of objects. It is a messy, continuous, overwhelming flux of perceptions, sensations, and emotions.
Actual experience is radically untidy.
It is disorderly, fragmentary, and its elements are not clearly differentiated. But language plays a subtle, constant trick on you. Language, molded by generations of common sense, foists exact concepts onto your mind.
It makes you imagine you experience a neat, trim, tidy world of perfectly defined objects happening at exact instants of time. But that neat, exact world is actually an internal mental construct. It is a world of ideas.
Let's ground this because it sounds incredibly abstract. I want to walk you through the analogy of a chair.
Oh, I love this part.
Imagine a definite chair in your mind, or just look at one near you right now. Common sense tells you it's just a single, solid, undeniable physical object. Wood, metal, fabric.
But the concept of that chair is actually a breathtakingly complex web of interrelated experiences.
It contains the sensory experience of the folk who originally made it. It contains the financial transactions of the people who sold it.
It includes the comfortable, tactile sense of physical support you might be feeling in your back right now.
And it even includes our conceptual expectations of its future, terminating finally in a totally different set of sensory experiences when that chair collapses decades from now and becomes firewood.
To form that seemingly simple concept of a chair out of raw, chaotic sensory input was a tremendous job of organization.
Zoologists and geologists suggest it took tens of millions of years of human evolution to arrange our conceptual code in this specific shorthand way. Science is entirely rooted in this apparatus of common sense thought.
But to truly make sense of the universe, science cannot proceed without departing from strictly what is actually in experience. It must admit what we call ideal experiences.
And ideal experiences are those imaginations of possible experiences that might have occurred.
For example, our thoughts of the unseen flora deep in the Amazon rainforest. You haven't personally seen it, you haven't touched those leaves, but your mind can construct an ideal experience of it to make your understanding of the world's biology cohere.
In the construction of a theory of space and time, there are insuperable difficulties if we refuse to admit these ideal experiences. They allow us to build an invisible scaffolding.
And this reliance on ideal experiences, this invisible scaffolding, brings us directly to the absolute necessity of logic.
There's an old political phrase, no bishops, no king. The scientific equivalent, Whitehead says, is no logic, no science.
Now, we need to carefully distinguish this scientific logic from metaphysics. Metaphysics inquires into how our sensory perception of that chair relates to some hidden, ultimate true reality behind the veil.
Science does not engage in that debate at all. Science simply gathers perceptions into a determinate class, adds those ideal perceptions we just discussed, and then works strictly and logically with that newly formed concept. The single organized concept of that set of perceptions is all that science needs.
But let's be honest, logic has a bit of a bad reputation, historically speaking. Many people hear the word logic and their eyes immediately glaze over. Why did humanity develop this instinctive distrust of logical theory?
It links back to the Renaissance. During that period, there was an intense, almost suffocating worship of classical authority. Scholars essentially became mere commentators on ancient texts.
A reverence towards any statement made by a classical author became the norm, and when a science hesitates to forget its founders, it is lost.
Because of that reverence, logic became barren. It became associated with endless, sterile academic commentary rather than vibrant discovery.
And there is a second, very persistent critique of logic. The belief that deductive reasoning can give you nothing new.
The argument suggests that if you know premise A and premise B, any logical conclusion you draw is already contained in what you know. So what is the point? It feels like running on a treadmill.
But this condemnation completely ignores the deeply fragmentary, disconnected character of human knowledge. Because mankind are not calculating machines, we can't instantly see all the consequences of our assumptions.
If you learn one incredibly complex fact on Monday and another completely different fact on Tuesday, that information is entirely useless to you on Wednesday without a logical filing system to tie them together.
Logic is the tool that creates a permanent record of deductions. And to truly understand how this invisible tool dictates your reality, we need to move slowly through the 4 stages of modern logical theory outlined in the book.
The first of these is the arithmetic stage. This deals with the most fundamental relations of propositions to each other.
Right, so in the past, this might have been taught by listing out every possible variation of truth and falsehood. The disjunctive derivatives, as they are called.
Exactly. Dealing with P, not PP or Q, it yields 8 disjunctive derivatives. But rather than getting lost in the weeds of formal notation, think of the stage like a massive soundboard in a recording studio.
Instead of listing all the variations, you have a few basic inputs. A statement is either true or it is false. It's binary.
But by flipping those switches, true, false, maybe one or the other, maybe both, you can generate an infinite number of complex outcomes. The core of this first stage is simply to settle the truth values. Is the switch on or is it off?
It is the foundation of every decision you make.
Once we have that foundation, we reach a limit. We cannot just talk about specific concrete things forever. We need a shorthand. We need placeholders.
And that is where we transition to the second section, the algebraic stage.
The crucial difference here is the introduction of symbols variables. This introduces the profound concept of a propositional function. Let's look at the foundational work of thinkers like Frege and Peano here. Consider a definite, true statement. The specific heat of mercury is 0.033.
But watch what happens when we replace the specific word mercury with a mere letter, a variable x. We get the specific heat of x is 0.033.
This is no longer a factual statement. It's a blank form.
Now, if we substitute the word water for x, we get the specific heat of water is 0.033. That is a perfectly valid statement, but its truth value is false. The switch is off.
This is where it requires careful thought because we hit a critical boundary in logic. What if we substitute the word virtue for x? The specific heat of virtue is 0.033.
Well, I've met a few people whose virtue definitely runs a bit cold, but I don't think I could accurately measure it with a thermometer.
Exactly. And that is the point. That statement is neither true nor false. It is entirely meaningless. It has no unit meaning of definite assertion because it belongs to the wrong type of argument.
There is a specific range of values for which our blank form actually makes sense, and this range is called the type of the variable.
The algebraic section of logic must grapple with this theory of types to prevent us from making fundamental, meaningless errors in our thinking. The establishment of the logic variable was a monumental leap forward for human thought, allowing us to process the universe abstractly.
From there, we move to the third stage, general function theory. In technical terms, this is where we transition from intension to extension, or denotation.
Let's strip away the jargon. Think of intention as the job description say, the requirement to wear a crown and rule the United Kingdom. Extension is the actual person who holds the job, King Charles.
In this stage, logic asks us to consider what happens when we analyze propositions about a class itself. Or more fascinatingly, what happens to our logic when the job description exists, but the person doesn't.
It allows us to process statements about alleged individuals who do not actually exist. The book uses the examples of the present King of England, written at a time when there wasn't one, or the present Emperor of Brazil.
It deals with complex correlations involving multiple variables, allowing our minds to navigate hypotheticals and non-existent entities without our logical framework collapsing. It is the architecture of abstract thought.
Finally, we arrive at the fourth section, the analytic stage. This is where we construct the great framework of applied mathematics. Number, quantity, time, space.
Whitehead details 7 special sorts of correlations here: one-to-one, serial, inductive, selective, vector, ratio, and three-cornered relations.
And this is crucial. We are being shown that mathematics is not some mystical, separate realm of absolute divine truth. Mathematics is merely an apparatus.
It is a highly specialized tool designed specifically for analyzing the deductions which can be drawn from the everyday premises supplied by our common sense. All those special mathematical concepts vanish into logical definitions.
This perfectly frames the relationship between inductive observation gathering the messy facts of the world and deductive logic. We need both.
Inductive observation gives us the raw materials, but common sense deduction moves by blind instinct. It fails completely when faced with a massive wealth of material. We need rigorous logical methods to build anything lasting.
Let's apply this to something spatial, something you can almost picture. Let's apply it to geometry.
I'm struggling a bit to see how we get from raw, chaotic sensory input to something as pristine as geometry. Let's take the concept of a point. Euclid defined geometric points as having no parts and no magnitude.
Yes.
But think about it. How is the notion of a point derived from the messy sense perceptions we just talked about? I've never actually seen or touched a true, perfect mathematical point in my life. Have you?
No one has. And that is the genius of this framework. You've never seen one because it is an ideal concept. Our knowledge of space is not based on observing actual perfect points. It is derived entirely from our experience of the relations between bodies.
A fundamental space relation between objects in the real world is that one body may be part of another, like a piece of wood is part of the chair.
Exactly. We might be tempted to define this whole and part relation by saying that the points occupied by the part are just some of the points occupied by the whole.
But if the relation of whole and part is actually more fundamental to human experience than the abstract notion of a point, then defining it that way is viciously circular.
We must find another definition rooted in logic, not in unseeable points. The conclusion reached is that an extended body is nothing else than the class of perception of it by all its percipients, both actual and ideal.
And the logic of whole and part based on this is incredibly elegant. Let's say we have two bodies, A and B, which are both classes of perceptions. Body B is a part of A when the class which is B is entirely contained in the class which is A.
From this logical form, it immediately follows that if B is a part of A and C is a part of B, then C is inherently logically a part of A.
The relation is transitive. These aren't fresh, arbitrary assumptions we are making. They follow inevitably from the strict logical form of our definition.
But to build this entire mathematical scaffolding of space, to make geometry work in the physical universe, we have to make one massive foundational assumption.
The ideal infinite divisibility of space.
We must assume that every class of perceptions, which is an extended body, contains other classes of perceptions, which are extended bodies diverse from itself endlessly.
This assumption makes a massive draft on the theory of ideal perceptions we discussed earlier. It demonstrates how deeply our entire understanding of the physical universe relies on our mind's capacity to logically organize ideal experiences that we cannot ever strictly sense.
Why are we dragging you through these deep stages of logic and geometric assumptions? Because this invisible scaffolding is what dictates your reality.
Every piece of technology you touch, every bridge you drive over, every medical breakthrough that extends human life relies on the fact that humans figured out how to turn chaotic, untidy sensations into organized thought.
The sheer scale of that conceptual architecture, it's breathtaking when you pause to let it settle. It is the ultimate triumph of the human mind. We take the noise of the universe and, using nothing but the inherited lighted torch of imagination and the rigorous filing system of logic, we compose the epic poem of reality.
As we continue to sit here with these immense ideas, I want to leave you with something to hold quietly in your mind until we pick this thread up again. Look at a simple object near you right now.
It could be a cup on your desk, the surface of a table, or the very device you're using to listen.
I want you to try to mentally strip away the language. Strip away the geometric assumptions, the clean lines, the absolute definitions you've been taught since childhood. Try, just for a moment, to experience that object purely as the disorderly, chaotic flux of raw sensation that we talked about.
It is a profoundly difficult meditation. When you sit with that raw, untidy sensation, pose this question to yourself. How much of the reality you inhabit today is actually experienced directly by your physical senses? And how much of it is an invisible mathematical scaffolding built entirely by the meticulous historical organization of human thought?
Just let that question linger in the quiet space around you, and we will simply continue from this very thought when we resume our journey. As we seamlessly pick up the thread of our ongoing discussion about Alfred North Whitehead's book, we're navigating right into the chapter concerning the anatomy of scientific ideas.
We are, yeah. And we're really shifting our focus here towards something profoundly fundamental, how our minds actually construct reality.
Right. It's looking at the transition from the everyday, comfortable realm of common sense to the highly complex, invisible world of physics.
Exactly.
And our mission as we continue this exploration is to completely deconstruct how we perceive simple everyday objects. Things like the chair you might be sitting in right now, or an orange on your kitchen counter, and rebuild them piece by piece through the rigorous lens of scientific theory and logic.
It is a profound shift in perspective, and Whitehead provides us with this incredibly precise framework to manage it.
Which we definitely need because it gets complicated quickly.
It does. To understand this transition from our everyday intuition to the realm of physics, we really have to start with the concept of geometry as he lays it out. He notes that geometry essentially vanishes unless you give it form, specifically through points. But, and this is crucial, he doesn't define a point as just a simple dot on a page, the way we might have learned in grade school.
Yeah, that really stood out to me.
Right. He defines a point as a class of extended objects which, in ordinary language, contain that point. It is an elaborate definition, but it's entirely necessary to avoid presupposing the idea of a point itself before we've even proven it exists.
Wait, let me make sure I'm following that, because a class of extended objects sounds a bit, abstract.
It is abstract, yeah.
Why does he need to redefine a simple dot? Is the advantage of introducing points into geometry just to make the math work, or is there a deeper philosophical reason here?
Well, the deeper reason is that science thrives on how things relate to one another in a clean, logical way. For the scientific method, the intuitive simplicity of a single definition is actually of slight importance compared to the simplicity of mutual relations.
Meaning how things interact is more important than what they are in isolation.
Precisely. Science is looking for the architecture of reality. And to illustrate this, think about his metaphor of an extended body, specifically a chair.
Okay, so if I'm looking at a wooden chair, my common sense tells me it's just a solid, static object. A child looks at it, understands it's something to sit on, and that's the end of the story.
Right.
But I'm guessing Whitehead argues that this simple idea is actually an illusion.
It is a highly functional illusion, but an illusion nonetheless. Physicists and chemists take that simple, solid idea of a chair and completely dissolve it.
They break it down.
They do. In their world, they turn that solid piece of wood into a bewildering, complex dance of molecules, atoms, electrons, and waves of light interacting with empty space.
It's almost hard to wrap your mind around when you're just looking at a piece of furniture.
It is, but by dissolving the common sense object, scientists gain concepts that have much simpler, more predictable logical relations.
That makes me think about the physical space around us. The space of my everyday experience, like the distance from my hand to my coffee cup, it feels very different from the theoretical space of vibrating electrons.
And Whitehead insists that the space of our common sense world is not necessarily the best mode for conceiving the space of the physicist. They are conceptually different.
They operate on different rules.
They do. However, he establishes one essential requisite. The correspondence between the common sense world and the physicist's world must be definite and reciprocal.
So the dancing molecules must reliably result in the chair you can actually sit on.
Exactly. There has to be a reliable bridge.
So to safely navigate between my comfortable reality and the chaotic reality of physics, we need logic. But I've always thought of logic as a rigid set of rules, something that boxes you in.
A lot of people do.
But Whitehead seems to have a very different, almost liberating view of it.
He does. He argues that logic, when properly used, does not shackle thought.
Yeah.
It is not meant to confine us at all. Instead, it gives us freedom and, above all, boldness.
Boldness. I like that.
Yes, an illogical mind is a hesitant mind. It hesitates to draw conclusions because it never really knows what its foundational assumptions are or what the domino effect of changing those assumptions might be.
So a mind untrained in constructive logic is essentially flying blind. It won't recognize the conclusions that naturally follow from its own observations.
Which means it will be dull in divining inductive laws. Yeah. To connect this to the bigger picture of human progress, Whitehead makes this deeply beautiful philosophical point about age and youth.
This is a really striking part of the book.
Yeah, he writes that we can conceive humanity as constantly engaged in an internecine conflict between youth and age. But he doesn't define youth by biological years.
Right.
He defines youth by the creative impulse to make something new.
That is a fascinating redefinition. If youth is the drive to create, then how does he define the aged?
The aged are simply those whose primary desire is to avoid making a mistake. They are cautious, protective of the established order.
Just trying to maintain the status quo.
Exactly. And logic, in this framework, serves as the ultimate bridge. Whitehead elegantly describes logic as the olive branch offered from the old to the young.
That's a great image.
It is. It is the structured, cautious wisdom of the past. But when you place that logic into the hands of youth, those driven by the fearless, creative impulse, it ceases to be a constraint. It becomes the magic wand that creates science.
With that magic wand in hand, it kind of begs the question, what exactly are the boundaries of the science we are creating?
Right. What are the limits?
Whitehead guides us into his definition of physical science by drawing a very strict line in the sand. He notes that physical science completely ignores all judgments of value. It has absolutely nothing to say about aesthetics, beauty, or morals. It is purely matter of fact.
And that boundary raises an immediate, profound question about human inquiry. If science is strictly matter of fact, it deliberately leaves out ontology.
Which is the determination of the nature of what truly exists in a fundamental sense.
Exactly, which is the realm of metaphysics. From a purely intellectual standpoint, Whitehead admits it is a pity to exclude metaphysics. We actually need metaphysical critique to tell us what our scientific discoveries ultimately amount to in the grand scheme of reality.
But he still keeps them separated. Is that just a practical choice so scientists can actually get some work done without debating the meaning of the universe every morning?
That is the exact reason. It is a purely practical choice. Mankind can actually reach agreements about science after due debate and experimentation.
Because the results are observable.
Yes. Metaphysics, historically, has only accentuated entrenched disagreements. He mentions how the ancient Greeks actually thought metaphysics was easier than physics.
They had it backwards.
They really did. They had a dangerous tendency to deduce scientific principles from assumed metaphysical ideas about the nature of things.
They were basically deciding what reality should be and then trying to make the physics fit that narrative.
Right. The Greeks were only restrained from total disaster by their vivid naturalism and their delight in first-hand observation.
So looking at the actual world saved them.
It did. Later, medieval Europe shared that same deductive top-down tendency, but unfortunately lacked the Greek restraint, which stalled scientific progress for centuries.
Wow.
Whitehead suggests that perhaps in the distant future, generations might actually reach unanimous conclusions on metaphysical questions, while science might be the discipline that fractures. But for now, we must take the case as we find it. Science and metaphysics must remain separated for practical progress.
Which leaves us with a fascinating problem. If we are ignoring metaphysics, how do we all agree about the scientific facts? What even is a fact?
That is the core question.
Whitehead says we have to look incredibly closely at our own perceptions. Can you walk us through his hello, red
Yeah.
example? Because reading that completely shifted how I think about seeing the world.
I'd love to. Let's say you are staring at a bright red traffic light.
Okay, I'm looking at the light.
When you look at that light and your mind forms the immediate, instinctive judgment, hello, red,
Mm.
Whitehead argues that you are making a massive conceptual leap.
A leap?
Yes. He says it is the thought that matters to science, not the raw element of perception. The field of physical science is composed entirely of these primary thoughts and of secondary thoughts about these primary thoughts. The phrase, hello, red, introduces a dangerous, false simplicity.
How so? It feels so simple. I open my eyes, the light is red, I see red.
Because nothing exists in isolation, you are not just seeing a disembodied red thing floating in a void. The perception of red is actually the perception of a red object in its complex relations to the entire content of your perceiving consciousness.
Okay, so it's contextual.
Highly contextual.
Yeah.
You are processing the contrast of the dark sky, the shape of the light housing, your memory of what a traffic light means.
So calling it a red object is technically incorrect.
Whitehead suggests is better termed an object of redness. The more scientifically accurate statement would be, hello, object of redness there in relation to me and everything else.
That's a mouthful.
It is, which is why we simplify. But the tendency toward false simplicity thinking, this real thing inherently possesses the quality of red, is a hangover from those earlier metaphysical stages we discussed. Our true goal in science is to make explicit our perception of the apparent object in terms of its relations to other apparent objects.
Think about what this means for you, the listener, as you sit in your car or at your desk right now. Every single thing around you, the steering wheel, the coffee cup, the wall, isn't simply what you assume it is. Your brain is performing a real-time, highly edited magic trick, presenting you with a simplified summary of reality.
And science aims to organize that magic trick into what Whitehead calls the harmony of thought. This means securing a state where judgments which are logical contraries do not exist together in our consciousness.
Logical contraries meaning contradictions.
Exactly. If you apprehend that traffic light as red, you cannot simultaneously apprehend it as blue.
But what if I'm colorblind or wearing tinted glasses and I realize later that it was actually a different color?
Amid the direct apprehension itself, there is no lack of harmony. The direct apprehension is entirely unique to that moment. If you see red, you see red.
Even if it's wrong.
Right. Later, you might judge that under different circumstances or without the tinted glasses, you would have seen blue. You might call your original apprehension an error, but the fact remains that your apprehension of the red object absolutely occurs.
This requires a very careful distinction between primary thoughts and secondary thoughts, doesn't it?
It does.
Primary thoughts are those direct sense presentations, the immediate raw experience of the red. Secondary thoughts are our thoughts about those thoughts, or thoughts derived from other thoughts. Like me thinking, I wonder if those glasses made the light look red.
That distinction is crucial for understanding the foundational material of physical science. In the realm of science, the facts are thoughts, and thoughts are facts.
Thoughts are facts. That flips common sense on its head.
It really does. The actual thought expressions, whether primary or secondary, are the literal material facts which science interprets. There is a common assumption that facts are given by the universe, but thoughts are free for us to invent. Whitehead argues that distinction is not absolute.
Because we have some control over our inputs.
Yes, we have some volition over our sense presentation by simply choosing to walk into a different room, and our internal stream of thought is only partially modified by our explicit willpower.
So, if facts are just our organized thoughts about sense presentations, what is the ultimate goal of science? He outlines a twofold scientific aim in the book.
Right. First, the production of a theory which agrees with our experience, and second, the explanation of common sense concepts of nature.
So science isn't trying to destroy common sense at all. It's trying to explain why common sense is such a useful tool for survival.
Exactly. The discovery of invisible molecules and electrons doesn't negate the existence of your coffee cup. It explains your vision and physical experience of the coffee cup.
Which brings us to how Whitehead handles the concept of objects. We naturally perceive things in space dogs, curtains, drops of water, flames, odors. But science explains the origin of these perceptions in terms of atoms and waves of disturbance propagated through space.
And this is where human perception gets incredibly tricky. We don't actually perceive a single wave of light.
Right, our eyes don't work like that.
The sensation of sight we experience is the resultant effect of the impact of millions of such waves hitting our retinas over a stretch of time.
To really grasp this, we should delve into his masterful example of the cat. It perfectly illustrates how our minds perform incredible feats of synthesis without us even realizing it.
It's a perfect example.
When a cat walks into the room, we don't actually directly perceive a singular, unified object called the cat. What we physically experience is a scattered collection of distinct, separate sense objects.
Disparate streams of sensory data.
Right. So I hear a sense object of sound, the mewing. I see a sense object of sight, the fairy shape arching its back. I feel a sense object of touch it rubbing against my leg.
Yes. But because they are simultaneous and spatially coincident, our thought immediately combines them into the perception of one unified cat.
It just happens automatically.
This combination is an instinctive judgment. It happens in milliseconds without any conscious effort of reasoning on your part. We must learn to distinguish between the many direct objects of sense data and the single indirect object of thought, which is the concept of the cat.
He notes that sometimes our brains are so eager to create that unified thought object, even a single sense object is enough for us to make the leap. We hear a mew in the dark hallway and immediately deduce, surely this is a cat.
Our brain fills in the blanks.
But sight is bolder. When we see the cat, we identify the sight entirely with the object, forgetting they are separate things. He mentions the classic historical illusion where birds actually pecked at the vividly painted grapes of Apelles, mistaking the sight object for the thought object of real food.
And we have to remember that even a single sense object is a complex entity spanning across time. He uses the example of a tile on the hearth. As you watch that tile in a steady bright light, the sight object remains unchanged.
It just sits there.
But if the room is lit only by a glancing turbulent firelight, the sight object of the tile alters continuously. The shadows dance, the colors shift. Yet you instinctively judge that the tile itself, as a thought object, remains unchanged.
To understand how we do that, we have to fundamentally rethink time. Whitehead asserts that there is no such thing as experiencing a sense object at an absolute frozen instant.
Instants are a mathematical abstraction.
Exactly. As we stare at the tile or the cat, there is a duration. We are experiencing a continuous stream of sight. We do not live in instants, we live in durations.
This concept of duration fundamentally alters how we must understand memory. We tend to think of memory as a filing cabinet of the past.
Like a static record.
Right. But if we live in a fading present, a present that is constantly, seamlessly becoming the immediate past, then the region of our consciousness is neither pure memory nor pure immediate presentation. The memory of a past event is actually a present element in your current consciousness.
Let me process that. When I remember taking a sip of coffee a moment ago, that memory isn't residing in the past. The act of remembering is a present tense element in my current state of consciousness.
Yes. And because of this continuous duration, we can establish directly perceived time relations between different events.
How does that work?
Well, we can perceive that event A precedes event B because both are held within the same present duration of consciousness. As the flow of time continues, event A fades further back and new events B and C occur. We remember the relation between A and B, and we inferentially construct the logic that A in the past must precede C in the present.
It's like a chain linking together.
Whitehead calls this the principle of aggregation. It is the fundamental mental glue by which we build the timeline of our external physical world.
Okay, so the principle of aggregation handles how we organize time. But what about space? The space relations between all these flickering sense presentations are confused and fluctuating. How does my brain make sense of the physical geometry of the room?
To explain this, Whitehead introduces what he calls the principle of convergence to simplicity with diminution of extent, which we can just call the principle of convergence.
The principle of convergence, okay.
It is essentially our brain's way of managing chaos. The rule is, the shorter the stretch of time and the smaller the area of space, the simpler the aspects of the sense presentation become.
So zooming in simplifies things.
By actively partitioning our chaotic sense world into smaller, more manageable parts of restricted space and time, the mutual relations between these parts become much simpler for the brain to process. This active, ongoing process of discrimination, driven by the mind's quest for simplicity, is what yields the stable sense objects we interact with.
To see how this works in practice, let's walk through his detailed example of observing an orange. If I walk up to an orange, look at it, handle it, and smell it for half a minute, my mind finds an approximate coincidence of those various space relations.
It bundles them together.
Right. It aggregates those different sensory inputs into a whole. He calls this a first crude thought object of perception.
And this is where both the principle of convergence and the principle of aggregation work together beautifully. Suppose you leave the room, and 5 minutes later you return to find the orange still sitting in the fruit basket. A new first crude thought object presents itself to your senses.
So it's technically a new presentation.
Yes, but your mind effortlessly, instantly aggregates the two presentations, the half-minute orange from before and the current orange you're seeing now, into the exact same orange. By aggregating these distinct temporal experiences, we obtain what he calls second crude thought objects of perception.
But Whitehead pushes the thought experiment even further. What do we actually mean when we say the orange is in the cupboard? When the cupboard doors are closed and we aren't looking at it, we can't perceive it, so we are relying entirely on imagination.
Specifically, the imagination of what he terms hypothetical sense presentations.
Hypothetical.
Yes, even when the cupboard is closed, we conceive the orange as a permanent collection of potential sense presentations, existing as if they were an actual element in our consciousness. We imagine its spherical shape, its dimpled texture, its citrus odors are still in there waiting for us.
Just sitting in the dark.
The realization that such imaginations exist and that they actively enter into the formation of our thought objects is the very first data of science.
I want to pause here for a second because this is incredibly relevant to how we move through the world. Our entire reality, trusting that the floor will hold our weight, trusting that our car is still parked where we left it, relies on this constant, invisible processing of hypothetical sense presentations. It is a fascinating, almost fragile way to view reality.
It shows how active our minds really are.
The thought object of perception is basically just a psychological device to make the chaotic stream of sense data manageable. But this device has severe limits, doesn't it? Sight can be easily baffled by reflections in a mirror or the way a stick looks bent when you dip it in water.
Illusions trick the system.
And sound is even more difficult. It disengages itself from the source. We hear the sound coming from the bell, but we say we hear the bell itself.
Another profound difficulty for our perception arises from the simple fact of change. A thought object, like our concept of the orange, is conceived as one stable thing, wholly actual at each instant.
But things don't stay stable.
No. Consider a piece of meat. It is bought raw, it is cooked in a pan, and eventually, if forgotten, it might burn to an unrecognizable cinder. How is it the same object? Or consider the ancient pyramids of Egypt. They remain largely unchanged for ages, yet over millennia, even they are not wholly unchanged by wind and erosion.
He brings up the Sphinx, which famously has had its nose chipped off. If a thought object is supposed to be one consistent, permanent thing, how does the Sphinx remain the Sphinx after losing a physical piece of itself?
Whitehead explains that the problem is we habitually make our thought objects too large. When faced with the paradox of change, we must apply the principle of convergence and think in smaller spatial and temporal parts.
Breakdown.
The Sphinx has changed because its nose was chipped off, but by proper inquiry, we could hypothetically locate that missing piece of stone somewhere in the sand or in a museum. Thus, by breaking the larger object down, either part, the rest of the Sphinx in the desert, or the chipped nose in a display case, regains its permanence as a separate thought object.
So change in any thought object is largely explained as a disintegration to smaller parts, which are themselves new thought objects of perception. It reveals that the material universe we confidently experience every day is largely a concept of our own imagination, resting on a surprisingly slender basis of direct sense presentation.
And this brings us to the threshold of theoretical physics. When physical phenomena absolutely defy explanation on these common sense lines, when looking closer and closer at the bent stick in the water no longer helps, science takes a fundamental leap.
It has to invent a new way of looking at things.
Yes, the thought object of perception is entirely superseded by the thought object of science.
Meaning we abandon the realm of what we can touch and see and enter the realm of molecules, atoms, and electrons.
Exactly. The peculiarity and the power of these scientific objects is that they have shed all the qualities capable of direct sense representation in our consciousness. You cannot see, hear, or touch an electron in the way you touch a cat or smell an orange.
They are beyond sensory experience.
They are conceived purely as the invisible mathematical causes of our sense representation.
This transition from human perception to theoretical science bridges the massive gap between the fluid vagueness of human sense and the exact definition of scientific thought. In scientific thought, a proposition is strictly true or false, and relations are expressible by definite mathematical propositions.
It demands precision.
Sense perception, as Whitehead beautifully notes, knows none of these strict rules except by courtesy. Accuracy essentially collapses at some stage of sensory inquiry, which is why we must ultimately rely on these invisible scientific thought objects to find the truth.
As we reflect on the architecture of these ideas, time and space emerge as comparatively simple foundational concepts. The differences in our sense content, the vivid colors, the overlapping sounds, the fluctuating temperatures are infinitely complex in their variety. But time and space relations are straightforward.
They are the anchor.
They are. This underlying simplicity is exactly why our minds take the infinitely complex variety of sensory data and throw it all into one heap, confining it within a short duration to create a stable thought object based on time and space.
It leaves you with a lingering, almost haunting realization. If these simple foundational concepts of time and space dictate the very reality of the molecules we cannot even see, how then do these invisible scientific ideas ultimately govern the rigid, unbreakable physical laws of nature?
And just as we sit here, letting those massive ideas settle, I want you to take a slow, quiet breath with us.
Just letting it all kind of echo for a second.
Yeah. We have been wandering through this incredibly vast architecture of human thought, exploring the grand aims of education and really the anatomy of how scientific ideas are born.
It's been a massive journey so far.
It has. But right now, in this exact moment, we're crossing a very delicate threshold in the book. We're moving away from those broad, sweeping concepts of how thought is organized, and we're stepping into the microscopic, almost magical mechanics of human perception.
The absolute foundation of how we see things.
Right. We are about to look at a fundamental mystery. How the messy, chaotic, glitchy way you and I actually perceive the world is somehow mathematically distilled into the rigid, perfect structures of science.
It really is a profound transition to make. It feels a bit like, I don't know, stepping out of a crowded, overwhelming street market into a perfectly silent, dimly lit room where you can finally hear your own heartbeat.
Oh, I love that imagery.
We're zooming in on the relationship between our senses. The book carefully lays out that when we perceive something, a complete sense presentation, any piece of that experience can be a part of the whole in two very distinct ways.
Right, the two parts.
Yes, it can be a part in time or a part in space. And the argument here is that these aren't just high-level abstract ideas. These relations, time and space, are entirely fundamental. They are the raw data directly presented to our consciousness.
And to really anchor that raw data, there's this incredibly grounding analogy in the book about simply looking at a chair.
The chair analogy is so gentle, but so devastating.
It really is. I want you to imagine you are sitting in a room right now looking at a chair resting in the corner. To you, a specific person at this exact fleeting moment in time, your personal vision of that chair is essentially indefinable.
It is purely yours.
Intimately yours.
Yeah.
We can all safely guess that what you are seeing is probably uncommonly like what I would see if I sat in your spot. But your actual lived internal experience of that chair, it belongs to you alone. It's totally subjective. Yeah, physical science quietly steps into the room.
Yes, and it performs this brilliant kind of substitution. Science looks at your intensely personal, indefinable vision and replaces it with a universally acceptable physical criterion.
It trades it in.
Exactly. It trades your subjective internal experience for definable molecules and waves of light that interact in very specific, measurable ways with the physical organs of your eyes. Science swaps out the intimate vision for a standard physical reality.
A standard so reliable that it is accepted in courts of law.
Right. It essentially reduces the holistic felt experience down to its mechanical parts.
And when we talk about breaking things down into parts, the book gets deeply specific about the logic of how a whole is actually composed.
The strict logical conditions.
Yeah, but instead of getting lost in the mathematical axioms about object A, object B, and object C, I was thinking about this like a child's Lego castle.
That is a perfect way to visualize it.
Right. Because if you have this completed Lego castle, that is your whole object. If you smash it on the floor, it breaks into distinct separate bricks. For that castle to be truly composed of those specific bricks, a few undeniable rules have to exist.
Walk us through them.
First, those scattered bricks actually had to be part of the castle. Second, the bricks have to be distinctly separated from each other. You can't have one brick magically melting into another, so you can't tell where one ends and one begins.
Has to be discrete.
Exactly. And third, there isn't some invisible, mysterious piece of the castle floating around that isn't made of those bricks. Meaning there is no part of the whole castle that is separated from both brick B and brick C. The whole relies entirely, 100%, on those specific, non-overlapping parts.
Precisely. The parts completely define the boundaries of the whole. There are no ghosts in the machine.
None.
But as we establish how physically solid that seems, we have to recognize a massive, almost unsettling divide the author points out. There is a gulf between what we physically feel and what we mentally calculate.
The two different spaces.
Yes. We really need to unpack the difference between sense time and sense space on one hand and thought time and thought space on the other.
This was the moment that really made me pause. Because sense time and sense space are what you and I actually observe as we walk around the world. And the shocking thing is what we actually observe is discontinuous.
It is totally fragmentary.
Yeah, our senses don't give us a smooth, unbroken 4K video of reality. We get flashes, we get pieces, we blink, we turn our heads, our attention drifts. Our raw sensory input is basically a glitchy, flickering movie reel.
It is entirely glitchy, but we don't feel like we live in a glitchy world, do we?
No, not at all.
And that is because of thought time and thought space. This is the realm of our perception, our mental map of the universe. And unlike our raw senses, our thought space is continuous.
It fills in the blanks.
Exactly. Our minds are constantly, quietly working in the background, patching over the gaps in our senses. Continuous in this context simply means that all the objects of our perception are woven together. They all have a defined time or space relation to each other in our minds.
So our brain invents a smooth, continuous reality to paper over the chaotic fragments our senses actually collect.
It weaves the tapestry.
Wait, so if our minds are constantly patching over these glitches, creating this smooth mental map out of rough sensory data, how do we ever measure anything accurately? If reality is that slippery, how do we pin it down?
That is the exact problem that gave birth to one of the most fundamental ideas in all of human history, the mathematical point. Out of that continuous thought space, we had to invent a way to anchor our calculations. But what is fascinating here is how wonderfully rebellious the book gets regarding what a point actually is.
Because we all learned Euclid's classic definition in basic geometry, right?
Yep.
That a point is something that has no parts and no magnitude. It has no size.
Right. But the author stops and argues that this classic definition is deeply flawed. Today, people often wave points away by calling them convenient fictions.
And the book points out that calling a mathematical point a fiction is incredibly ambiguous. It uses this wonderfully quiet, humorous example.
The red man.
Yeah, it says, imagine the fiction of a red man in a green coat inhabiting the moon. That is a fiction, sure. But it provides absolutely no scientific service to us simply because it corresponds to no actual fact.
It's just a fantasy.
Right. So if a geometric point is just a convenient fiction, it can't just be a fantasy. It must correspond to some very important actual facts in the physical world. It has to be a mechanism for directing our attention to real relationships.
Exactly. It isn't a fantasy, it is a tool. And this brings us to the driving force behind why points are intellectually constructed in the first place. The book calls it the principle of convergence to simplicity.
Let's walk through that because the mental exercise the author uses to explain this convergence is beautiful, but it takes a second to visualize.
It takes some focus, yeah.
It relies on the concept of an enclosure, where one object literally encloses another. Think of the classic Russian nesting dolls, where each doll perfectly swallows the smaller one inside it.
And for that to work logically, the relationship has to be transitive and asymmetrical.
Right, doll A encloses doll B encloses doll C, so doll A encloses doll C.
And it relies on the indefinite divisibility of objects in space and time. You can just keep going smaller.
Exactly, but to get to a mathematical point, we have to imagine an infinite set of these enclosures constantly getting smaller.
Yes. The author calls these routes of approximation, which is such an elegant phrase. It is how the human mind arrives at perfect simplicity.
Let's do the exact geometric exercise from the book.
I want you to picture a rectangular box floating in front of you. It has a specific height, a breadth, and a thickness. Now, in your mind, keep the height and the breadth completely fixed. Don't let them change.
Okay, holding them fixed.
But begin to shrink the thickness. Make the box thinner and thinner and thinner indefinitely. If you keep shrinking that thickness towards zero, that converging series of boxes eventually approximates a perfect plane, a flat surface with absolutely no thickness at all.
That's the route to a plane. And you just keep taking that route of approximation further.
Right.
If you take that same box, but this time you only keep the central line of its height fixed, and you shrink both the breadth and the thickness indefinitely, you converge on a perfectly straight line segment.
You're stripping away the dimension.
Exactly. And finally, the ultimate simplicity. If you fix only the exact microscopic center of that box, and you shrink the height, the breadth, and the thickness all at once, crushing it down indefinitely, the series converges to a single dimensionless point.
It is a stunning mental architecture. You can picture it as concentric spheres continuously shrinking, zeroing in on the exact same ultimate center.
Like homing in on the truth.
The book explains that this elaborate mental machinery is the only way the mind can move from a bulky, messy physical object down to an idealized point.
But I think the natural question you'd ask listening to this is, why? Why do we go through all this trouble of indefinitely shrinking imaginary boxes?
The book is remarkably clear about this.
It says the sole practical use of points is to tame the overwhelming complexity of reality. Points allow us to handle the margins of error in our physical world.
That's the real aha moment. If we connect this abstract geometry to the everyday world, it completely changes how we interpret basic statements.
Right?
Think about a simple everyday claim. The distance between that wall and this table is exactly 2 feet. The author argues that this exact statement doesn't actually apply to real physical objects because physical objects are messy.
They have rough edges.
They vibrate. For actual real-world objects, we are really saying the distance lies somewhere between 2 feet plus or minus a tiny margin of error. Let's call it E.
Right, and that margin of error, that E, is a number we can choose to be as impossibly microscopically small as we please. By shrinking that margin of error down to an infinitely small limit, using the concept of a point, we create a mathematical condition that perfectly expresses the idea of being 2 feet apart.
We use the perfection of points to anchor the imperfection of reality.
And once we have those points, we build the universe. We mathematically construct straight lines by logically aggregating points, collinearity, and we build flat planes the same way, coplanarity.
But the philosophy here pushes even further. It moves past the lines and the planes and looks at the vast yawning spaces between them. It delves into the nature of empty space.
And this is where we have to strip away some old ghosts.
Yes, we do.
The book brings up Occam's razor, the famous philosophical rule that we shouldn't multiply hypothetical objects beyond what is strictly necessary. It firmly rejects the old, comfortable idea that all of empty space is secretly filled with invisible, hypothetical material, just so we have a physical foundation to place our geometric points on.
Common sense really supports this refusal to fill the void with ghosts. When you walk outside and look up at the night sky, you see the stars. You naturally ask if there are physical objects in the dark stretches between the Earth and those stars.
And for us, the space is just there. The void exists.
Exactly. The book beautifully defines what it calls ideal points to explain this. An ideal point in space might be occupied by a piece of matter, like a star or a speck of dust, or it might be completely unoccupied.
Based on sets of material lines, right?
Yes, an empty, unoccupied point in the void doesn't need to be made of invisible material. It simply indicates a possibility. It is a map of potential spatial relations that haven't been realized yet. Empty space is just the thought space of the material world. It's the canvas of what could be.
That shift from insisting space must be full of hidden things to accepting space as a map of pure possibility is the bridge into the most staggering realization in the book.
It really is the turning point.
It marks the transition from old philosophy into the bleeding edge of modern science. Because the older philosophy always assumed that the things we perceive are the actual ultimate things of reality. But modern science has entirely replaced our perceived objects with unseen molecules, electrons, and waves.
It really is a heavy realization to sit with. If modern science is correct, nobody, not you, not me, not the greatest physicist, has ever actually perceived a physical thing in its true ultimate form. We only ever perceive an event.
I want to make sure we really capture that. We don't perceive things, we perceive events.
Exactly. The ultimate foundational building blocks of the scientific world are utterly unperceived. What we experience as a chair or a flash of light or the warmth of a fire is just our sensory organs catching the delayed ripples of a series of microscopic events.
The hidden things are implicated in those events, but never seen directly.
Never.
Now, adopting this view explains the vague, fluid nature of our senses. But historically, it required humanity to abandon some incredibly deep-seated beliefs. For centuries, mankind operated on a strict rule the denial of action at a distance.
Right. It was common sense. If you want to move a rock, you have to physically touch the rock. For two things to affect each other, they had to be in physical contact. If they are separated by an empty void, they are disconnected.
And because the scientific community was so terrified of abandoning that common sense belief, they invented a wildly flawed imaginary concept to save it: the ether.
The ether is one of the most fascinating blunders in scientific history. It was hypothesized as this invisible, continuous, jelly-like substance filling the entire universe,
Just to avoid action at a distance.
solely for that reason. So scientists could explain how light or gravity could travel through space without admitting that things could act on each other from afar. If the ether filled the void, then everything was technically touching.
But the book systematically dismantles this. It points out the fatal logical flaw. The ether was said to possess only potential energy, essentially sitting still, while the atoms moving through it possessed kinetic energy.
It was logically troubled from the start.
It was a conceptual bandage. By inventing the ether, science was just making up an invisible middleman. It was a way to cheat their own rules. And here is where modern science, quietly and brilliantly, stepped away from the old panic debates.
They realized it was a hopeless endeavor to try and build our complex reality out of perfectly simple, disconnected little billiard ball entities.
Right.
It stopped looking for isolated fragments. What modern physics aims at now is finding persistence and regularity. And this brings us to the ultimate climax of the book's argument regarding reality, the concept of the field.
The field changes our understanding of existence entirely. Instead of tiny hard dots floating in an ether, modern science defines reality through fields.
A field is a continuous distribution of scalar and vector quantities throughout space and time.
And to avoid getting lost in the physics jargon of scalars and vectors, let's ground this in something you can feel.
Good idea.
Imagine you are standing in a room. The temperature in that room varies. Maybe it's warmer near the fireplace and cooler near the window. That temperature map is like a scalar field. It's a specific value at every point.
And then imagine a draft of wind blowing through that same room, possessing both speed and direction. That is like a continuous vector distribution.
So when we talk about something like an electron, the book urges us to stop thinking of it as a tiny, hard, isolated bead of matter. The electron is a continuous distribution. It has its dense center, like the warmest part of the room, its volume density of electricity, and it has the continuous vector distribution, the electric and magnetic forces it exerts outward, like the wind.
And here is the truly breathtaking part. The book insists that the dense center and the outward forces are not separate things.
They are one.
The electron's core and the massive rippling field of its emanations form one single essential whole. It is one complex thought object that literally physically fills all of space.
Fills all of space.
Yes. And the state of its field right now, in this exact microsecond, is completely determined by the past histories of all other electrons in the universe, extending infinitely backwards in time, echoing across the distances. Every single particle is historically, physically interwoven with everything else.
It is an incredible journey the author takes us on. We started with the chaotic, glitchy stream of our human senses, learned how our minds patched that into a continuous map, saw how we invented geometric points to tame the margins of error, and finally arrived at this permanent, uniform reality of invisible, universal fields.
It's a complete architectural breakdown of science.
It is. But as we reach the end of it, the author does something so gentle and unexpected. Remember, way back at the beginning of this process, the book deliberately excluded two deeply human concepts from the cold, hard formulas of physical science.
Judgments of worth and ontological judgments.
Yes. It set aside human values to look purely at the mechanics. But in the final, quiet twist of this chapter, the author brings our humanity right back to the center of the frame.
It's beautiful.
While it is true that judgments of value, our sense of aesthetics, our morals, our utilitarian needs, are not part of the mathematical formulas of a scientific field, they are the absolute undeniable motive for its production.
Mankind didn't raise the massive, echoing edifice of science by accident. We built it because we judged it to be worthwhile.
Think about the motives. Maybe it's the pure aesthetic beauty of discovering a perfectly balanced mathematical structure.
Or the deep moral duty we feel to explore and uncover the absolute truth of our existence.
Or maybe it is just the practical utilitarian desire to build a better bridge or cure a disease to satisfy our physical wants. Whatever the reason, without these deeply human judgments of value, there would be no science at all.
Science is entirely born from our desires, and those ontological judgments are quiet, internal beliefs about the very nature of being and reality. They were never truly discarded.
They are presupposed in every single act of our daily lives.
They live in our affections for one another. They live in our quiet self-restraints. They are the foundation of every constructive effort we make as a species. Science isn't a cold, detached ledger.
No, it is ultimately driven by our profound, distinctly human need to find value, beauty, and meaning in the permanence and uniformity of the universe.
Exactly.
So as we sit here together in this quiet space, I want to leave you with a thought to hold on to. If this modern scientific reality is true, if the world is entirely composed of unperceived events, if a single electron's field physically fills all of space, rippling with the deep, vast history of the entire universe, extending infinitely backwards in time, echoing through the dark, how does that change the way you perceive the very room you are sitting in right now? Take a breath and look at the air around you. Is the empty space between you and the walls truly empty? Or is it a vibrating, living field of infinite historical connections? We are stepping straight into the quiet, deeply philosophical waters of Alfred Whitehead's book, The Aims of Education. Specifically, we're looking at Chapter 10, which he titles Space, Time, and Relativity.
And if you are listening to this right now, we really want you to just completely shift your perspective. Slow down. We are exploring how humanity actually perceives space, time, and reality.
Exactly. Our mission here is to bridge that seemingly impossible gap between cold, abstract mathematics on one side and the raw, jagged, highly subjective lived experience of human consciousness on the other.
To do that, Whitehead asks us to step back from our everyday comfortable assumptions. He wants to examine the foundational scaffolding of reality itself. And the first thing we have to recognize is that physical science is not just a collection of purely objective, detached facts.
Right, which is kind of how it's usually taught, isn't it?
It is, yeah. But Whitehead points out that science is fundamentally based on what he calls elements of thought. It relies heavily on judgments. Not just judgments that register actual perceptions we have in the moment, but judgments about hypothetical perceptions.
Hypothetical perceptions, like guessing what we might see.
Sort of. It's the underlying assumptions about what we would perceive under very specific circumstances. Science builds theories on those assumptions.
But hold on, doesn't modern science usually try to strip away the subjective human experience? I mean, we are taught that science is the pursuit of objective truth, completely independent of human thought. Why is Whitehead dragging elements of thought and basically metaphysics into physics?
Because it is a failure of logic to reject metaphysics. There is a really strong tendency in the modern empirical era to dismiss metaphysics as just, empty philosophical speculation.
Yeah, scientists often roll their eyes at the philosophers.
Exactly. But Whitehead calmly dismantles that idea. Science takes our chaotic sensory experiences and organizes them into cohesive theories. By doing so, it proves that our logical internal thoughts are intimately connected to external sensory facts.
Let me make sure I'm following this. Are you saying that if a scientist tries to reject metaphysics entirely, they are actually undercutting the very foundation of their own scientific method?
Precisely. A scientific theory that ignores its own foundational elements of thought fails, just as physical science fails when it cannot harmonize its own raw data. You cannot separate the mind that observes from the universe that is being observed.
I see. But wait, if physicists, mathematicians, and psychologists are all ultimately studying the same reality, space, and time, why aren't they talking to each other? Whitehead calls out a distinct fragmentation of disciplines here, basically a massive silo effect.
Yes, and the book provides very specific examples of this isolation. First, consider the mathematical physicists. They're busy evolving complex theories of relativity. Why? Specifically to explain the negative results of complex physical trials, like the famous Morley-Michelson experiment or the Troughton experiment.
Let's actually pause there, because the Morley-Michelson experiment is crucial, but often glossed over. For anyone listening who isn't a physicist, scientists in the late 19th century were trying to prove that light moved through an invisible physical fluid in space called the ether.
Right, the luminiferous ether.
Yeah, think of it like trying to measure the speed of a boat moving through a river's current. They built incredible instruments to measure the Earth moving through this ether, but the experiment failed. They found absolutely nothing.
A completely null result.
Exactly. The speed of light was the same in every direction. Physicists basically had to invent relativity just to explain that failure.
And that is exactly the context we need. The physicists are focus purely on the physical phenomena and the complex mathematics required to reconcile those unexpected experimental outcomes. But meanwhile, down the hall, you have the experimental psychologists.
And what are they looking at?
Well, they're not looking at light waves or interferometers. They're looking at brains. They are studying the evolution of spatial ideas derived directly from crude sense data. They are tracking nerve impulses and asking how you, the listener, take a raw visual or tactile input and build a mental concept of space inside your mind.
So you have physicists staring at lasers, psychologists staring at brains, and then you have the metaphysicians, right? What are they doing during all this?
The metaphysicians are gazing at the majestic, boundless uniformity of space and time. They're pondering a reality without beginning, without end, without boundaries, and without exception.
How's peaceful?
It is, but they spend their time contrasting these perfect uniform qualities with the confused, accidental, messy nature of the empirical universe we actually live in.
And finally, locked away in a completely different building, you have the mathematicians.
Right.
They are strictly studying the axioms of geometry. From a very limited set of assumptions, they deduce everything they believe to be universally true of space and time. So, physicists, psychologists, metaphysicians, and mathematicians are all staring at the exact same elephant, entirely blind to each other's perspectives.
Which is a huge problem. Whitehead notes that while a healthy independence of thought can sometimes help us avoid compounding other people's errors, true intellectual progress requires cross-fertilization. We must look at how allied problems are treated in other sciences.
Otherwise, we just stay trapped in our own paradigms.
Exactly. Without bringing these diverse standpoints into relation with each other, our understanding of reality remains permanently fractured.
And this brings us to a brilliantly simple observation Whitehead makes, which really cuts to the core of relativity. He points out that we never ever actually measure empty space.
It is a complete paradigm shift. Think about it. All space measurement is from physical stuff in space to other physical stuff in space. The purely geometrical entities of empty space never actually appear to us.
Never.
No. The only geometrical properties we have any direct, immediate knowledge of are the properties of those shifting, changeable appearances we call things.
Wait, so if I am looking at the room I'm sitting in right now, I am not measuring the invisible void of the room. I am measuring the distance from the lamppost outside to the window to the chair I'm sitting in. We measure the distance from the Earth to the sun. We're always constantly measuring from matter to matter.
Exactly.
Wherever humanity got its concept of an infinite, unchangeable, invisible void of space, it certainly did not come from immediate, direct observation.
And recognizing that simple fact leads us directly into two antagonistic philosophical ways of dealing with space and time. The first camp utilizes what is called the a priori method, largely associated with Immanuel Kant.
The Kantian view.
Yes. This view affirms that space and time are absolute conditions for sensible experience.
Let's translate that a priori concept for you, the listener. Under the Kantian view, think of space and time as built-in software running in your mind. You simply cannot experience the universe without projecting space and time onto it.
It's the prerequisite.
Right. In the very act of experiencing anything at all, your mind necessarily makes you aware of space as an infinite given whole and time as an unending uniform succession. The software comes first, the experience comes second.
Now, contrast that with the opposing philosophical method, the experiential view. This side argues that our concepts of time and space are deductions drawn entirely from experience.
So they come after the fact.
Yes. They are deduced in the exact same way that the law of gravitation is deduced from watching an apple fall from a tree. We observe physical things, we form exact concepts of points, lines, and surfaces, we observe successive instants of time, and finally, we frame a conceptual model to express the facts of our experience.
I want to push back on this a bit, though. Doesn't almost everyone naturally assume the first view?
Right.
We tend to think space is just an empty box that the universe was poured into.
We do. It's very intuitive.
Both of these philosophical positions seem designed to explain a specific difficulty. The a priori theory explains the absolute universality we feel about the laws of space and time. But the experiential theory explains how we derive space-time concepts without introducing magical external factors beyond what physical science can observe.
And this debate forces us to look closely at two very different models of space itself. We have the absolute theory versus the relational theory. The absolute theory, which was famously favored by Isaac Newton, asks us to conceive of the points of space as self-subsistent, independent entities.
So imagine a massive, invisible, rigid, three-dimensional grid stretching out to infinity. Under Newton's absolute space, when you say the sun is there, you are saying that the physical matter of the sun happens to currently occupy a specific set of points on that pre-existing invisible grid.
The grid is sovereign.
Right, the grid exists entirely independent of the sun. Even if the universe were completely empty of all matter, that absolute spatial grid would still be sitting there, completely unchanged.
But the opposing view, associated with Leibniz, is the relational theory. This theory states that there is no invisible pre-existing grid. There is no such entity as a self-subsistent point in empty space.
Then what is a point?
A point is merely a name we give to a specific relationship between pieces of actual matter. Space is defined purely and entirely by the relations between physical things.
So if I take away the sun, the earth, the lamp, the chair, you were saying space itself ceases to exist. It is just a relationship.
According to the relational theory, yes. Without physical matter, the concept of space is entirely meaningless. Space is just the relationship between the objects. This outcome essentially escaped the notice of mathematicians for a long time because they invariably assumed the point in space was the ultimate, unquestionable starting ground of their reasoning.
Whitehead then draws a profound analogy between this relational concept of space and how we experience time. Just as a point in space is nothing else than a certain set of relations between physical things, a point in time is a set of relations between events.
Yes. In analyzing our experience, we distinguish events, and we distinguish the things whose changing relations form those events. Spatial extensions are expressed by how objects contain, exclude, or overlap each other. Temporal extensions are expressed by how events relate to one another.
Which means we do not actually live in single, freezing, instantaneous mathematical points in time. You do not experience your life as a series of isolated 0-second snapshots.
You couldn't function if you did.
Exactly. Think about listening to a piece of music. You don't hear a 0-second slice of a C sharp. You hear the note as it begins, sustains, and fades into the next note. We live in durations, overlapping spans of time.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. And the durations of two events can relate to each other in several specific ways. One may precede the other, they may partially overlap, or one may completely contain the other. A point in time is not a direct deliverance of experience. It is a complex set of relations between these overlapping temporal durations.
So what does this mean for you, the listener, as an observer of reality? Whitehead suggests that locating something in space and locating something in time both require your mind to make a profound judgment of externality.
Meaning you have to mentally recognize things existing outside of your own consciousness.
Right. To illustrate just how subjective this judgment of externality can be, the book takes us through a highly complex but vital mathematical thought experiment involving diverse Euclidean measure systems.
This is a fantastic section.
I want you to imagine two intelligent observers. We will call them being A and being B. They are both looking at the exact same physical reality, trying to measure the exact same space.
Okay, so they agree on a fundamental starting point. They are both using the exact same three intersecting axes. The x, y, and z axes we all learned in geometry. They both employ standard Euclidean geometry. They are looking at the same reality using the same mathematical language. So far, complete harmony.
But here's where the fracture occurs. They proceed to adjust their differences by establishing their units of measurement. They look at the x-axis. Being A declares a specific physical segment along that axis to be his unit of length. He calls it 1 unit.
Makes sense. Being A holds up his ruler and says, this is 1.
But being B looks at that exact same physical segment and decides to call it beta units. Being B decides to mathematically adjust his system so his unit length matches being A's. But because being B must use this same unit for all his measurements across all axes to maintain his internal mathematical consistency, his measurements on the y and z axes are now proportionally altered.
Wait, let me make sure I'm explaining this right for the listener. Because B mathematically adjusted his measurement on the x-axis, it unknowingly warps his math on the other axes.
Yes. So when they look at a physical sphere, being A calculates the perfectly symmetrical mathematical equation of a sphere. But being B, using his mathematically valid but distinct units, calculates the geometry of an ellipsoid, an elongated oval shape. Their measurement of angles is now hopelessly at variance. even though both are perfectly mathematically correct within their own systems.
Whitehead provides an incredible analogy to help visualize the root of this difficulty, the rigid measuring rod. Imagine being A holds a solid steel yardstick. To him, his rod is perfectly invariable. It does not change length.
It's solid steel.
Exactly. But when being A turns his rod in different directions to measure the Y or Z axis, being B observes that rod as mysteriously changing in length according to a specific physical law.
And the exact opposite is true for being B. Being B procures his own rigid measuring rod. To being B, his rod is perfectly stable and invariable, but being A looks at B's rod and declares that it is stretching and contracting as it moves through space. Both beings are employing mathematically perfect, diverse Euclidean metrical systems, yet they cannot agree on the fundamental measurements of reality.
The profound implication here is that estimates of quantity, estimates of distance in space, and even estimates of order in time depend entirely on the individual observer. Whitehead is basically asking you to unlearn the idea that there is one objective way to measure the universe. There are infinitely different, entirely valid systems of measurement possible for the exact same space.
Which raises the most crucial question of this entire text. If measurements of time and space are this subjective and entirely dependent on the observer's specific system, what exactly is the real world?
It's deeply unsettling.
It is. What are the crude deliverances of sensible experience that have the best claim to be called actual reality, apart from the imaginative mathematical reconstructions we build in our heads?
Well, Whitehead asserts that the actual factual reality is incredibly fragmentary. We do not naturally experience a smooth, mathematically perfect universe. We experience jagged, chaotic, isolated moments of perception. He uses the Latin term disjecta membra, which means scattered fragments.
To really drive this home, the book uses the striking analogy of the material pyramids of Egypt. When you think of the pyramids, you conceive of a massive, smooth, continuously existing, geometrically perfect structure enduring through centuries of time and space. But that is a logical construction. It is a concept.
Right, the material pyramid is just a mental model. What is actually factually real regarding the pyramids? The reality is the incredibly fragmented, fleeting, subjective experiences of all the millions of different human beings who have gazed upon them over millennia.
The raw sensory input of a laborer hauling stone in 2000 BC.
Yes, a faded photograph taken in 1920. The momentary glance you might give them as a tourist today, squinting in the harsh sun, those raw, disconnected sensory inputs are the actual factual data of experience.
From those chaotic, jagged fragments of sensory data, the human mind performs a miraculous feat of logical building up. As our concepts become more abstract, their logical relations become smoother, more general, and less liable to exception. Mathematical time and mathematical space are not realities we live inside of. They are incredibly smooth, abstract, overarching concepts that humanity has logically constructed out of these fragmentary worlds of experience.
This leads us to Whitehead's subtle but brilliant twist on Kant's philosophy. Remember earlier we talked about Kant believing space and time were the built-in software necessary for experience to occur at all.
The a priori method.
Yes, Whitehead respectfully but firmly turns this doctrine in the complete opposite direction. He argues that in the raw act of experience, we do not simply impose a pre-existing grid of space and time. Instead, we naturally perceive a whole world formed of related, differentiated parts.
The relations between these parts possess certain characteristics, and what we call time and space are simply the expressions of some of these relations.
He calls this the uniformity of the texture of experience. The success of mankind in deducing uniform laws of nature is a testimony to the fact that this uniformity of texture is deeply embedded in the raw data of our experience. We don't invent the order out of thin air. We derive it from the texture of what we naturally perceive.
But Whitehead warns us that this uniformity is of a much more abstract character than we usually allow. The process of lifting this uniform time and space out of the physical world into the status of logical abstractions requires a very specific procedure. We must realize that all speculation must start from those fragmented individual conscious experiences that disjunct a membra as its sole absolute datum.
We do not start with space. Whitehead gives us the ultimate procedural conclusion, the golden rule of this entire philosophy. We must first define things purely in terms of the raw sensory data of experience. We establish the physical things first. Only then, once the things are defined by perception, can we define space in terms of the relations between those things.
I must emphasize the vital point Whitehead makes here regarding the physical world. The only exact data we possess as to the physical world are our sensible perceptions. We must not slip into the fallacy of assuming that we are comparing a given mathematically perfect objective world with our subjective perceptions.
The physical world itself, in its general sense, is a deduced concept. It is, in a way, a logical fairy tale we have constructed to house our experiences.
Our actual problem as conscious beings trying to understand the universe is to fit this conceptual mathematical world to our raw perceptions. We must not make the mistake of trying to force our pure, jagged, authentic perceptions to fit into a preconceived absolute world. It is a profound inversion of how we typically navigate reality. We assume the space is real and we are just moving through it. Whitehead asks us to realize the perceptions are real and the space is the abstract logical web we weave to connect them.
I want you to just quietly look around at the objects in the room right now. Consider the possibility that the empty space between them isn't a pre-existing infinite void you are sitting inside of. Consider that it is merely an invisible web of mathematical relationships your own mind has continuously, relentlessly deduced from your fragmented senses.
Which carries us right into the next phase of his axioms, where we have to apply this relational framework directly to the broader principles of